The great rift has torn the galaxy in half, and in its wake, madness bleeds through the veil of reality, like poison through a wound. For 10,000 years, the Imperium of Man has endured the whispers of the warp, but never before has chaos pressed so close to the material realm. The stars themselves weep with the agony of a universe at war with its own soul. Yet even in this age of endings, when hope gutters like a candle in an endless storm, legends may yet be born. Not from the nobility of terror, nor from the gene-forged might of the Adeptus Astartes, but from something far older and infinitely more dangerous, a force that knows the taste of divine blood upon its blade. The world of Tertius Prime burned beneath an ashen sky when the first rift opened. It was not the familiar tear of a warp storm, nor the calculated breach of sorcerous ritual. This wound in reality pulsed with something else entirely, a rage so pure and ancient that even the Neverborn recoiled from its touch. The very air screamed as dimensions folded upon themselves, and through that screaming void stepped a figure that belonged to no age the Imperium had ever known. Kratos emerged from the rift like a nightmare, given flesh, his pale skin marked with the ashes of a dead family, his eyes burning with the fury of 1,000 betrayals. The blades of chaos materialized in his hands, as if summoned by will alone, their chains wreathed in flames that had consumed gods and titans alike. Yet for all his terrible majesty, he stood not as conqueror, but as something far more unsettling, a weapon without a master, a killer of gods who had lost his pantheon to slaughter. The Chaos Space Marines of the Word-Bearers had come to Tertius Prime, seeking converts and slaves. They found instead a population already broken by months of siege, their faith cracked like glass beneath the weight of endless suffering. Dark Apostle Vectros had smiled as he walked among the ruins, his chaplain's Crozius crackling with unholy power, speaking of the fourfold path and the mercy that lay within damnation. But when the rift tore open above the cathedral square, Vectros felt something he had not experienced since his fall, 10 millennia past. Fear. The being that stepped from the bleeding sky moved with a predator's grace, scanning the carnage with eyes that had seen the death of Olympus. The Word-Bearers paused in their desecration, transfixed by this newcomer who wore no familiar heraldry. His armor bore no purity seals, no litanies of hate or devotion. Yet the power that radiated from him made even veteran Chaos Marines step backward. "What manner of Astartes are you?" Vectros called out, his voice carrying the authority of 10,000 years of slaughter. "What legion claims you, warrior?" Kratos turned those burning eyes upon the Dark Apostle, and for a moment the very air between them seemed to calcify with menace. The ghost of Sparta had faced the rage of Zeus, the cunning of Athena, the madness of Ares himself. This armored zealot, for all his corruption, was merely another priest of false gods. "I serve no legion," Kratos replied, his voice carrying the weight of collapsed mountains. "I serve no gods." The Word-Bearers laughed then, a sound like breaking glass and burning parchment. Their faith in the ruinous powers was absolute, their corruption complete. What could this lone warrior do against the chosen of the dark gods themselves? Vectros raised his Crozius, and the 8-pointed star upon its head blazed with warp fire. "Then you serve nothing, and nothing you shall become. The gods demand—" The blades of chaos took his head before he could finish speaking. What followed was not a battle, but an execution. Kratos moved through the Word-Bearers like a scythe through wheat, each strike carrying the focused fury of lifetimes spent warring against divine tyranny. Their bolter shells bounced harmlessly from his skin, their chains wards shattered against his blades. When they called upon their patron powers, seeking the blessings of chaos, they found their prayers answered only by silence and steel. The last word-bearer fell gurgling in the cathedral square, his gene-enhanced body split from crown to groin. Kratos stood amid the carnage, breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the familiar satisfaction of righteous slaughter. Yet something nagged at him, a wrongness in the air that spoke of corruption deeper than mere battle madness. "Emperor, protect us," whispered a voice from the shadows of the ruined cathedral. "What are you?" Kratos turned to see the survivors emerging from their hiding places. Imperial Guard troopers whose uniforms hung in tatters, civilian refugees clutching makeshift weapons, a lone sister of battle whose power armor bore the scars of weeks of desperate fighting. They stared at him with expressions caught between terror and desperate hope. The sister stepped forward, her bolt pistol held low but ready. Sister Superior Magdalena had fought chaos for 20 years, had seen horrors that would break lesser minds. Yet this warrior who had appeared from nowhere troubled her in ways she could not name. His strength was undeniable, his skill evident in the corpses around him. But there was something in his bearing that spoke of battles fought in realms beyond her understanding. "I am Sister Superior Magdalena of the Order of the Bleeding Rose," she said carefully. "You fight against the heretic, so I name you ally unless you prove otherwise. But I ask again, what are you? What chapter claims you as battle brother?" Kratos studied her for a long moment, recognizing something in her stance that reminded him of the warriors he had known in better days. There was steel in her, tempered by faith rather than broken by it. She deserved an honest answer, or as much of one as he could give. "I am Kratos," he said simply. "I was a god of war once. Now I am something else." The Imperial survivors exchanged glances, heavy with confusion and disbelief. The sister's grip on her weapon tightened, but she didn't raise it. In the Imperium, claims of divinity were blasphemy of the highest order, yet this warrior had just slaughtered a war band of Chaos Space Marines single-handedly. "The heretics spoke of gods," Magdalena said slowly. "They claimed to serve 4 powers that demand worship through corruption and slaughter. They called them—" "I know what they called them," Kratos interrupted, his voice hardening. "I have heard such claims before, from priests who sought to chain mortals with promises of power and threats of damnation." An old guard sergeant, his face marked by chemical burns from the siege, stepped forward with the careful movement of a man who had seen too much war. "Those things the word-bearers served," he said quietly. "They're real, sir. We've seen what they do to worlds, to people. They twist everything they touch, turn devotion into madness, love into obsession. They feed on suffering like beasts." Kratos felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar recognition that made his hands tighten around the chains of his blades. He had walked this path before, had stood in the shadow of divine cruelty, and felt the weight of mortal suffering pressing down upon him like a burial shroud. "Tell me of these gods," he commanded, and his voice carried an authority that made even the sister straighten unconsciously. "Tell me how they rule, how they claim their worshippers, how they feed upon the pain of the faithful." And so they told him. They spoke of Khorne, the blood god who demanded endless slaughter in his name, turning warriors into mindless berserkers who knew only rage and bloodshed. They described Tzeentch, the changer of ways, who spun plots within plots until hope itself became a weapon of corruption. They whispered of Nurgle, the plague father, who offered freedom from pain through the embrace of decay and disease. They wept as they spoke of Slanesh, the Dark Prince, who promised perfection while delivering only endless hunger that could never be satisfied. With each word, Kratos felt the familiar fire building in his chest, the same righteous fury that had driven him to tear down Olympus stone by stone. Here were gods who claimed dominion over mortals, who fed upon their emotions like parasites, who turned faith into chains and devotion into damnation. He had seen this pattern before, had lived it, had paid its price in the blood of his own family. "They are no different from those I have known," he said, when the survivors had finished their tales. His voice carried a finality that made the air itself seem heavier. "They demand worship through fear, claim love through manipulation, offer power while binding souls in chains of gold. They are gods, and gods must die." Sister Magdalena stared at him, with eyes wide, with something between horror and desperate hope. "You speak blasphemy," she said, but her words carried no conviction. "The Emperor alone is worthy of worship, but even he struggles against these powers. They are eternal, unchanging. They have existed since the birth of emotion itself." Kratos turned his burning gaze upon her, and for a moment she saw something in those depths that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not madness, nor the cold calculation of a heretic. It was the absolute certainty of a being who had looked upon the throne of Zeus and found it wanting. "I have killed gods before," he said, and the words fell like hammer blows upon an anvil. "These four shall join them." The wind picked up then, carrying with it the smell of distant fires and the whispered promises of the warp. Above them, the great rift pulsed with malevolent light, as if something vast and terrible had taken notice of the words spoken in the shadow of a ruined cathedral. In the depths of the immaterium, four entities that had feasted upon the galaxy's pain for 60 million years stirred uneasily upon their thrones of bone and brass and crystal and flesh. The ghost of Sparta had come to their realm, and for the first time since their birth, the Chaos gods would know what it meant to be afraid. Kratos looked up at the bleeding sky and smiled. The war was about to begin. The city of Tertius Prime had known 7 days of silence before the second wave arrived. In that brief respite, the survivors had dared to hope that the worst had passed, that the strange warrior who called himself a god might somehow be their salvation. They should have known better. Hope, in the 41st millennium, is merely the prelude to greater despair. Sister Superior Magdalena stood upon the cathedral steps, watching the horizon burn with fresh fires. The Vox channels crackled with desperate reports from the outer districts. More Chaos forces moving in coordinated strikes, their roars echoing across the ruined cityscape. But these were not word-bearers come to preach damnation. These were something far worse. "World-eaters," she whispered, recognizing the blood-soaked heraldry through her magnoculars. "The butcher children of Angron himself." The cornate berserkers came like a tide of crimson rage, their chainswords shrieking hymns of violence, their bolt pistols barking staccato prayers to the blood god. At their head strode warriors, whose minds had long since drowned in the red haze of endless slaughter. They sought not conquest or conversion, but the simple, pure joy of killing for its own sake. Kratos heard the screams before he saw the butchers. He had been standing in contemplative silence beside the corpses of the word-bearers, lost in memories of other gods, other pantheons that had claimed dominion over mortal lives. But the sound of innocent blood being spilled ignited something primal within him, a fury that burned brighter than the flames of the blades of chaos themselves. "Where?" he demanded, turning to face Magdalena with eyes that blazed like dying stars. The sister pointed toward the residential quarter, where families had huddled in their hab blocks, praying to the Emperor for deliverance that would never come. Smoke rose in black columns from a dozen buildings, and the air carried the metallic tang of fresh slaughter. Kratos was already moving before she finished speaking. He found the World Eaters in the market square, their crimson armor slick with the blood of shopkeepers and children. A Chaos Lord in elaborate Terminator armor stood amid the carnage, his power fist dripping with gore, while his berserkers carved through fleeing civilians with the methodical precision of harvesters in a wheat field. They laughed as they killed, their voices distorted by vox grills into mechanical hymns of hate. The Chaos Lord, who had once been called Captain Varric of the 12th Legion before madness claimed him, turned toward the sound of approaching footsteps. He expected to see more prey, more innocent flesh to feed to his god's endless hunger. Instead, he found himself facing a warrior whose very presence made the air taste of iron and fury. "Another loyalist dog," Varric snarled, raising his combi bolter. "Come to die for the corpse emperor's children? I will paint the walls with your blood and offer your skull to—" The blade of chaos took his arm off at the shoulder before he could finish the boast. Varric staggered backward, staring in shock at the cauterized stump where his weapon arm had been. No mortal warrior could move that fast, could strike with such devastating precision. Yet this pale-skinned giant had crossed 20 meters of open ground in the space between heartbeats. "You serve a god of blood," Kratos said, his voice carrying the cold authority of an executioner. "Let me show you what gods truly bleed." The World Eaters charged with the mindless fury of rabid beasts, their chain axes roaring, their bolt pistols spitting death. Kratos met them not as a tactician or a soldier, but as something far more terrible, a force of nature given form and purpose. His blades moved in patterns too complex for mortal eyes to follow, carving through ceramite armor as if it were parchment, sending enhanced limbs spinning through the air in graceful arcs of crimson spray. One berserker, his skull helm marked with fresh kill tallies, managed to land a glancing blow with his chain axe. The weapon's teeth shrieked against Kratos' skin and shattered like glass against stone. The World Eater stared in disbelief at his broken weapon for the brief moment before the blades of chaos separated his head from his shoulders. Within minutes, a dozen of Khorne's chosen lay dead in the market square. But Varric was not finished. The Chaos Lord's remaining hand clutched a brass icon, marked with the 8-pointed star, and he began chanting in the old tongue of Kolchis, calling upon his patron god for aid. The air above the square split like rotten fruit, and from the wound in reality stepped a creature born from humanity's oldest nightmares. The bloodthirster stood 4 meters tall, its massive frame wreathed in flames that burned without heat, its brass armor inscribed with the names of every soul it had claimed across 10,000 years of slaughter. Mighty wings spread wide as it hefted an axe that had been forged in the very heart of Khorne's brass citadel. "Mortal!" the demon roared, its voice like the sound of breaking worlds. "You have spilled blood upon this ground. Khorne is pleased. Kneel and serve the true god of war." Kratos looked up at the towering demon and smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "I have heard such words before," he said, advancing with measured steps, "from Ares, who claimed dominion over all warfare. I left his corpse bleeding in the marble halls of Olympus." The bloodthirster's flames guttered for a moment, confusion flickering across its bestial features. Then rage reasserted itself, burning away all thought save the need to spill blood in Khorne's name. It brought its massive axe down in an overhead strike that would have split a land raider in half. Kratos caught the blade between his crossed chains. For a moment, the two titans strained against each other, the bloodthirster's supernatural strength pitted against the god-forged sinews of the ghost of Sparta. The daemon's flames licked harmlessly at Kratos' skin, finding no purchase against flesh that had bathed in the fires of Mount Olympus. Gradually, inexorably, the chains began to twist, and hairline cracks appeared along the demon's axe blade. "Impossible," the bloodthirster snarled, pressing harder. "You are mortal. You are weak. You are—" "I am Kratos," came the reply, calm as a tomb. "And you are nothing." The blades of chaos erupted into motion, carving through brass and demon flesh with equal ease. The bloodthirster's roar of pain echoed across the city as ichor sprayed from a dozen wounds. It staggered backward, wings flapping desperately, trying to gain altitude and escape this impossible opponent. Kratos would not let it flee. He leapt, his divine strength carrying him 30 meters into the air, and drove both blades deep into the demon's chest. They fell together, the bloodthirster's death scream shaking the foundations of nearby buildings. When they struck the ground, only one rose again. The silence that followed was profound. Even the distant sounds of battle seemed muted, as if the city itself held its breath. Varek, still clutching his summoning icon, stared in horror at the ichor-stained crater where his patron's greatest servant had fallen. "My lord," he whispered, his voice breaking. "My God, why do you not answer?" In the depths of the warp, something vast and terrible stirred upon its throne of brass and bone. For the first time in 60 million years, Khorne felt something that might have been uncertainty. The warrior who had slain his bloodthirster radiated a power that the blood god could not categorize, could not understand. It was divine, yet foreign. Familiar, yet utterly alien. The sound of approaching aircraft broke the spell. Imperial Valkyries descended from the ashen sky, their engines roaring like mechanical angels. From their holds stepped figures in power armor, marked with the symbol of the Holy Orders. Inquisitors, come to investigate reports of impossible events and heretical manifestations. Inquisitor Cassius Vex had served the Emperor for over 2 centuries, had faced demons and heretics across a dozen sectors. His psychic gifts had been honed by decades of training, his faith tempered in the fires of righteous warfare. Yet as he looked upon the carnage in the market square, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the planet's nuclear winter. "Sister Superior," he called to Magdalena, who had arrived with his retinue. "Report. What transpired here?" Magdalena gestured toward Kratos, who stood cleaning demon ichor from his blades with the methodical precision of a craftsman maintaining his tools. "The warrior you see before you, my lord. He destroyed them all. The World Eaters, their lord, even a greater demon of Khorne. Single-handedly." Vex's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on Kratos, taking detailed pict captures and running them through his cogitator implants. No match found in any Imperial database, no known gene lineage, no recorded heraldry or chapter markings. The warrior appeared to be human, yet his actions suggested something far beyond mortal capability. "You there!" Vex commanded, his voice carrying the authority of the throne. "Identify yourself. What chapter claims you as battle brother? Under what authority do you operate in this sector?" Kratos turned those burning eyes upon the Inquisitor, and for a moment Vex felt the weight of ages pressing down upon him. This was not the gaze of a space marine, disciplined and gene-enhanced though they might be. This was something older, something that had looked upon powers beyond the Imperium's understanding. "I serve no chapter," Kratos said simply. "I answer to no authority save my own conscience." The Inquisitor's hand moved instinctively toward his bolt pistol. In the Imperium, such words were tantamount to heresy. Yet the evidence of the warrior's loyalty was scattered around them in the form of dead Chaos Marines. Vex had survived 2 centuries by trusting his instincts, and those instincts told him that this being, whatever else it might be, was no servant of the ruinous powers. "Explain yourself," Vex demanded. "The Imperium has records of every loyal Astartes chapter. You appear in none of them, yet you fight against the enemies of mankind with skill that borders on the supernatural. Who are you?" Kratos studied the Inquisitor for a long moment, weighing his words. He had dealt with such men before, servants of power who believed their authority came from divine mandate. Sometimes they could be reasoned with. More often, they simply became another obstacle to overcome. "I am a killer of gods," he said finally. "I have come to this galaxy because it suffers under the tyranny of 4 beings who claim divine authority over mortal souls. I will see them destroyed, as I have destroyed their kind before." Vex felt his blood turn to ice. In the Imperium, claims of divinity were the highest form of blasphemy. Yet before he could speak, his accompanying psyker, a sanctioned witch named Astropath Thymen, suddenly convulsed as if struck by lightning. The psyker's eyes rolled back in his head, revealing only whites shot through with veins of gold. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made nearby glass crack and mortar crumble from the walls. "Olympus burns," Thymen whispered, his words echoing with psychic resonance. "The hall of Zeus lies empty, its pillars broken, its throne cast down. Ares bleeds upon marble floors, his godhead scattered like coins from a beggar's purse. The Kraken stirs no more in Poseidon's depths, for the Sea Lord's trident lies rusted and forgotten. He who stands before you has walked among the tombs of gods and left only silence in his wake." The psyker collapsed, blood streaming from his nose and ears. Vex caught him as he fell, his mind reeling from the implications of what he had just heard. If the vision was true, and sanctioned psykers rarely lied, even when they went mad, then the warrior before them had indeed slain beings of divine power. "Impossible," Vex breathed, looking up at Kratos with new understanding and fresh terror. "The Emperor alone is divine. There can be no others." Kratos's expression didn't change, but something in his stance suggested infinite patience, coupled with equally infinite danger. "Your Emperor is not the first being to claim godhood," he said quietly. "Nor is he the first to demand worship from those who should be free to choose their own path. But that is not why I am here. I come for the 4 who feed upon suffering, who turn faith into chains and hope into poison." In the warp, Khorne rose from his brass throne and bellowed his rage across the immaterium. The sound of it drove 1,000,000 demons to their knees and shattered the crystal spires of Tzeentch's impossible city. For the first time since the war in heaven, the blood god felt something that might have been fear. The ghost of Sparta had come to claim another pantheon, and Khorne was no longer certain he could stop him. The dreams came that night like poison dressed as wine, seeping through the barriers of consciousness with the subtle malice that only Tzeentch could weave. In the ruins of Tertius Prime, as Kratos rested in the shadow of a broken cathedral, the Changer of Ways reached across the veil of reality to touch the mind of the god-killer. But Tzeentch had not expected to find scars there, old wounds carved by divine betrayal and tempered by millennia of regret. The architect of fate, who had broken the will of primarchs and twisted the hopes of entire civilizations, found himself probing a psyche that had already learned the taste of godly deception. In the vision, Kratos stood once more in the halls of Olympus, but they were wrong, corrupted. The marble columns were stained with ichor that ran like tears, and the golden light that had once illuminated the throne room now flickered with the uncertain glow of dying stars. Upon Zeus's throne sat a figure draped in impossible geometries, its form shifting between shapes that mortal minds could not properly perceive. "Welcome, God-slayer," the figure spoke with a voice like breaking crystal and distant thunder. "I am Tzinch, the architect of fate, and I have watched your path with great interest. Your rage burns bright, but rage alone is a crude tool. Come, let me show you what you truly fight for." The vision shimmered, and suddenly Kratos' family stood before him. Lysandra, his beloved wife, reached out with arms that bore the marks of fresh wounds. Calliope, his daughter, laughed with a voice that carried harmonics of madness and joy intertwined. They were as he remembered them, yet touched by something else, a corruption so subtle it might have been mistaken for blessing. "Father," Calliope whispered, her young voice echoing strangely in the transformed halls. "We have been waiting for you. The gods here are different, kinder. They do not demand sacrifice or blind obedience. They offer freedom through change, growth through transformation. Join us, and we can be a family again." Lysandra stepped forward, her eyes reflecting depths that contained more colors than should exist in nature. "My love, you have carried the burden of our deaths for so long. Here, death is not an ending but a doorway. The changer of ways has shown us wonders beyond imagining. Cast aside your anger and embrace the joy of infinite possibility." For a moment, Kratos felt his resolve waver. The weight of centuries pressed down upon him, the endless cycle of violence and vengeance that had defined his existence since that terrible day in the Temple of Athena. Here was what he had always sought: his family restored, his guilt absolved, the promise of peace that had eluded him across multiple lifetimes. But then he noticed the details that Tzinch had been too clever to hide completely. The way shadows fell wrong around his wife's form, the subtle wrongness in his daughter's laughter, the fact that neither of them bore the scars he remembered so clearly. These were not his loved ones returned, but phantoms crafted to exploit his deepest pain. "No," Kratos said, his voice cutting through the illusion like a blade through silk. "I know the taste of divine lies. I have supped at that table before." The throne room flickered, and for an instant he glimpsed something else. A crystalline maze that stretched beyond the boundaries of thought itself, its walls inscribed with equations that described the probability of every choice ever made. At its center sat a being of pure ambition given form, its bird-like features twisted into an expression of frustrated cunning. "Impossible," Tzinch snarled, the careful mask of benevolence falling away. "All mortals desire. All can be tempted. You are no different, no matter how many gods you claim to have slain." Kratos smiled, and the expression carried more menace than 1,000 threats. "I learned long ago that the dead cannot be truly restored by those who would call themselves divine. My family rests in peace, and I will not see their memory profaned by your schemes." The vision shattered like glass, and Kratos woke to find himself surrounded by azure flames that cast no heat. The ruins of the cathedral were gone, replaced by an impossible architecture that shifted even as he watched. Pillars of crystallized thought supported vaults that contained entire galaxies, while staircases wound upward through dimensions that folded back upon themselves. He was no longer on Tertius Prime. Somehow, during the false dream, Tzinch had pulled his consciousness into the warp itself, into the very heart of the Changer's domain. Here, in this realm of pure possibility, the architect of fate held power absolute. "Welcome to my crystal labyrinth," came Tzinch's voice from everywhere and nowhere. "Here you will learn the futility of opposing change itself. I am transformation incarnate, the force that drives all progress and growth. You cannot destroy me any more than you could destroy the concept of ambition or the dream of something better. Warriors materialized from the shifting walls. Thousand Suns Space Marines, their baroque armor crackling with eldritch energies, their empty eye lenses glowing with the stolen souls of their fallen brothers. At their head strode a sorcerer, whose name had been struck from all imperial records, his power staff topped with the skull of a demon prince he had bound to his will. "Ozek Ahriman sends his regards," the sorcerer said with mock courtesy. "I am Magister Kaon of the Thousand Suns, and you will find that the arts of Prospero are not so easily dismissed as Cornete Fury." The space around Kratos began to warp as the sorcerers raised their staves, chanting in the old tongue that predated human speech. Reality twisted like heated metal, turning solid matter into thought, and thought into chains of binding energy. The very air became thick as honey, weighing down his limbs with the force of accumulated possibility. But Kratos had faced sorcery before, had stood against the combined might of the Olympian gods when they had sought to bind him with the very laws of fate itself. Deep within his chest, something stirred, not rage, not fury, but something far more dangerous to beings who fed upon the darker emotions of mortal hearts. Hope. The power that Athena had gifted him in her final moments blazed forth like a newborn star. It was not the desperate hope of the drowning man or the bitter hope of the conquered. It was the hope of those who refuse to surrender, who face impossible odds and choose to fight anyway. It was the hope that had driven him to challenge Zeus himself, knowing he might fail, but unable to accept injustice simply because it wore a divine face. The binding energies shattered like ice in a furnace. The Thousand Suns chanting faltered as their sorcery turned to ash in their throats. Kaon staggered backward, his enhanced transhuman physiology struggling to process the psychic backlash of magic, utterly negated by a force he had never encountered. "What are you?" the sorcerer gasped, his ancient mind reeling. No mortal should possess such power. No being should be able to simply ignore the fundamental forces of the warp. Kratos advanced through the azure flames, his form now wreathed in a golden light that seemed to burn the very concept of impossibility from the air around him. The crystal labyrinth groaned as its perfect geometry began to crack, unable to accommodate something that existed outside its careful calculations. "I am the ghost of Sparta," he said, and each word rang like a funeral bell. "I am he who refused the gifts of gods, who chose suffering over slavery, who walked away from power that might have made me Zeus's equal. I am hope incarnate, and you cannot corrupt what you cannot comprehend." Zinch himself manifested then, no longer content to work through intermediaries. The changer of ways took a form that hurt to perceive directly, a constantly shifting amalgamation of bird and serpent and pure mathematics, its feathers inscribed with the names of every choice never made, its eyes containing the reflection of futures that could never be. "You interest me," the god admitted, its voice carrying harmonics that made reality ripple. "I have watched your path from afar, seen how you shattered one pantheon through will alone. But you mistake me for the crude tyrants you have faced before. I do not demand worship. I simply am. I am change itself, the force that drives stars to burn and mortals to dream. To destroy me would be to end all possibility of growth, all hope of improvement." The god extended one talon, and in its reflection, Kratos saw 1,000 futures, worlds where his family lived, realities where Ares had never corrupted him, timelines where the gods of Olympus were benevolent shepherds rather than tyrannical masters. All of it could be his, the changer seemed to say. All of it for the simple price of acknowledging that some powers were beyond challenge. "I have seen such futures before," Kratos replied calmly. "Athena showed me what might have been if I had chosen differently in the temple that day. But dwelling upon what cannot be changed is another form of chain, and I will wear no god's shackles willingly." He raised the blades of chaos, their fires now burning with the pure white light of hope rather than the crimson glow of rage. "You are not change itself, bird god. You are simply another tyrant who has grown too clever in his cruelty. You feed upon the dreams of mortals and call it blessing, twist their hopes into obsession and name it growth. You are the cancer that claims to be evolution, the poison that proclaims itself medicine." The battle that followed was not one of blade against claw, but of absolute concepts given violent form. Tzeentch hurled possibilities at Kratos like spears, visions of failure, prophecies of doom, calculations that proved the mathematical impossibility of his success. Each attack struck with the weight of logical certainty, attempting to convince him on a fundamental level that resistance was futile. But hope, true hope, cared nothing for logic or probability. It burned through every vision of defeat, transformed every prophecy into a challenge to overcome. Where Tzeentch's power sought to bind and limit, hope simply refused to accept limitation. Where the god's influence attempted to corrupt and twist, hope remained stubbornly, impossibly pure. The crystal labyrinth began to collapse around them as fundamental forces clashed. Entire sections of the maze dissolved into component thoughts, while others crystallized into permanent monuments to the impossibility of their conflict. The thousand suns fled, their enhanced minds unable to process a battle between concepts that preceded their understanding. "This is not possible!" Tzeentch screamed, its perfect composure finally cracking. "I am eternal! I am inevitable! I am—" "Afraid," Kratos finished, and drove both blades deep into the god's shifting form. The changer of ways shrieked as hope burned through its essence like acid through flesh, not destroying, not yet, but marking it, scarring it in ways that would never fully heal. For the first time since its birth in the dreams of ancient shamans, Tzeentch felt something it had never experienced, genuine uncertainty about its own survival. The god fled then, its form dissolving back into the deeper layers of the warp, leaving behind only the echo of its rage and the first seeds of something that might have been fear. The crystal labyrinth shattered completely, casting Kratos back into the material realm with enough force to crack the foundations of reality itself. He materialized in the ruins of Tertius Prime to find Inquisitor Vex and Sister Superior Magdalena standing over him, their faces etched with concern and terror in equal measure. Above them, the great rift pulsed with new patterns of light, patterns that spoke of gods in council, of ancient enmities set aside in the face of a common threat. "What happened?" Magdalena asked, her voice carefully controlled. "You collapsed during questioning, and the very air around you began to burn with psychic discharge. Our astropath felt something vast stirring in the warp, something that radiated malevolence beyond measure." Kratos rose to his feet, still feeling the touch of alien dimensions clinging to his skin like oil. "The second god has shown his hand," he said simply. "Tzeentch, the changer of ways, attempted to bind me with visions and false promises. He failed." Vex's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on strange readings emanating from Kratos's form. "The energy signatures are unprecedented," he murmured. "Whatever you did in that psychic trance, it has sent ripples through the immaterium itself. Our long-range Vox is picking up reports from across the sector. Chaos forces are moving with unusual coordination, as if responding to some central command. Above them, in the roiling depths of the warp, 4 gods that had never truly cooperated in 60 million years of existence began to speak as one. Corny's rage at his bloodthirster's death, Tzeentch's fury at his scheme's failure, and the growing awareness of Nurgle and Slaanesh that something beyond their understanding had entered their domain. For the first time since the war in heaven, the ruinous powers would work in true harmony. Not because they had overcome their fundamental differences, but because they faced something that threatened them all equally. The ghost of Sparta had declared war on godhood itself, and even chaos could recognize an existential threat when it stood bloodied but unbroken in the ruins of their schemes. The real war was about to begin. The transport ship Pious Resolve bore Kratos away from the ruins of Tertius Prime through the warp-touched void, its ancient hull groaning with each passage through unstable space. Inquisitor Vex had insisted on personally escorting this anomalous warrior to the Ordo Malleus fortress on Cadia. But the Great Rift had other plans. A cascade failure in the Geller field generators cast them into real space, above a world that should not have existed in any imperial star charts. Mortuous Garden World hung in the void like a diseased eye, its surface wreathed in clouds of sickly green vapor that pulsed with their own malevolent life. What had once been fertile agricultural plains now festered with corruption, so profound that it had achieved a twisted form of beauty. Forests of bone-white trees grew in perfect spirals, their branches heavy with fruit that bled amber tears. Rivers flowed backward, carrying not water but liquid thought, seasoned with the dreams of plague victims. "Death Guard," Sister Superior Magdalena whispered, as she studied the augur readings. She had insisted on accompanying the expedition, claiming that her duty to the Emperor demanded she witness whatever revelations this mysterious warrior might bring. An entire system's worth of them, by the signatures, and something else, something that makes the machine spirits weep. Kratos stood at the observation deck, his burning gaze fixed upon the corrupted world below. He had felt the touch of Nurgle's influence during the final days of his war against the Norse gods, when Baldur's curse had shown him the bitter mercy that lay within accepting inevitable death. But this was different. Not the natural cycle of ending that allowed new growth, but a perversion that celebrated decay for its own sake. "We should retreat," Vex said quietly, his augmetic implants registering corruption levels that would overwhelm even the most blessed purification rituals. "That world is lost beyond redemption. Nothing pure can survive in such an environment." "Then it is exactly where I need to be," Kratos replied, already moving toward the hangar bays. "If these gods would corrupt the natural order itself, then they must see the cost of their blasphemy." The Thunderhawk gunship Emperor's wrath descended through the toxic atmosphere like a falling star, its sanctified hull plates smoking as they fought against airborne pathogens that could rust blessed steel in moments. Kratos felt the first touch of Nurgle's gifts as they broke through the cloud cover, a creeping numbness in his limbs, a sweetness in his breath that spoke of organs slowly dissolving into their component humors. But divine flesh, forged in the fires of Mount Olympus and tempered by the torments of Hades itself, was not so easily claimed. The diseases that would have reduced a mortal man to soup within heartbeats found no purchase in his god-born physiology. His body adapted, evolved, overcame with the relentless efficiency of something that had already died and chosen to live again. They set down in what had once been the planetary capital of Septimus Hive, now transformed into a garden of delights that would have made Hieronymus Bosch weep with recognition. The streets ran with honey that buzzed with flies made of crystallized laughter. Buildings grew like living things, their walls pulsing with veins that carried nutrients to windows that blinked like eyes. In the central square, a fountain of bile and mercury played eternal music on pipes carved from the bones of saints. It was beautiful. It was horrific. It was everything that made Nurgle the most dangerous of the ruinous powers, not because he promised power or pleasure or wisdom, but because he offered peace through acceptance of the inevitable. The first Imperial Guard survivors they encountered had been reduced to walking scarecrows, their flesh eaten away by diseases that kept them alive just long enough to spread to others. A sergeant whose face was a map of open sores tried to raise his lasgun with arms that ended in clusters of flowering pustules. Emperor protects," he wheezed, each word releasing clouds of spores that made the air shimmer with possibility. Are you real? Or another gift from grandfather?" Kratos knelt beside the dying man, studying the mixture of agony and bliss that warred across what remained of his features. He had seen such expressions before, on the faces of those who served gods, that claimed to offer mercy through suffering. "I am real," he said gently, and for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, his voice carried no threat of violence. "What is your name, soldier?" "Matthias. Matthias Kane, of the Vostroyan Firstborn," the sergeant gasped. 30 years of service, 30 years of faithful duty, and for what? To die slowly while the enemy calls it blessing. The ghost of Sparta felt something stir within him that had nothing to do with rage or vengeance. Here was a warrior who had served his ideals faithfully, who had earned an honorable death in battle, reduced to this mockery of existence by powers that claimed benevolence while delivering only torment. "You have served with honor," Kratos said, and placed a hand on the man's fevered brow. "That honor should not be forgotten." The blades of chaos materialized with a whisper of flame, and Matthias Kane died cleanly, his suffering ended by steel, blessed with the tears of gods. Around the square, his surviving men looked upon this mercy, with eyes that still retained enough humanity to feel grateful. "Grant us the same," they pleaded with voices like autumn leaves. "Let us die as soldiers, not as these things we have become." One by one, Kratos granted their request. Each death was swift, clean, honorable, the kind of ending that warriors deserved, rather than the slow dissolution that Nurgle's gifts promised. With each mercy killing, he felt something shift in the very air around him, as if the garden world itself was struggling to understand an act of kindness that carried no ulterior motive. It was then that she appeared, emerging from the ruins of a chapel whose walls still bore the faded image of the imperial Aquila. Sister Superior Celestine wore the black and bone livery of the Order of the Valorous Heart, her armor scarred by weeks of fighting against enemies that could not be truly killed. Blood seeped through the joints of her power armor, and her face bore the telltale signs of someone who had witnessed horrors beyond accounting. But her eyes burned with the same determination that had driven Kratos to challenge Zeus himself. "You fight with honor," she said, her voice carrying the iron discipline of a lifetime spent in service to the Emperor. "That is rare in this place. Most who come here either flee in terror or embrace the corruption willingly. You do neither." Kratos studied her face, and for a moment saw not a warrior of this grim future, but an echo of another child, another daughter whose laughter had once filled halls that were now empty, The resemblance was not physical. Celestine was dark where Calliope had been fair, scarred where his daughter had been unmarked by war. But there was something in her bearing, a stubborn refusal to yield in the face of impossible odds that spoke to memories he had thought buried forever. "I do what must be done," he replied simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." Celestine nodded, recognizing something in his words that resonated with her own code of honor. "I am Sister Superior Celestine of the Order of the Valorous Heart. I have been fighting the Death Guard here for 17 days, seeking to cleanse a shrine they have corrupted with their foul rituals. But their numbers are too great, and their plagues too virulent. Even blessed adamantium cannot stand forever against such corruption." "Show me," Kratos said, and there was something in his voice that made her believe this stranger might succeed where an entire order of battle sisters had failed. The shrine lay at the heart of the garden world's transformation, a temple dedicated to the Emperor's light that had been twisted into a monument to Nurgle's grotesque bounty. Where once golden eagles had perched, now sat creatures that were part toad, part angel, their wings dripping with honeyed poison. The altar where imperial saints had once been venerated now supported a massive cauldron that bubbled with the liquefied remains of every soul the Death Guard had claimed. Demon engines prowled the perimeter, plague-burst crawlers whose main guns wept tears of acidic joy, fetid bloat drones that sang lullabies of decay in the voices of children who would never age. At the shrine's center stood a figure in Baroque Terminator armor, so corrupted that it had become one with the diseases it carried. "Typhus," Celestine breathed, her voice tight with recognition and hatred. The host of the Destroyer Hive, herald of Nurgle himself. The Chaos Lord turned toward them with the slow deliberation of continental drift, his tusked helmet releasing clouds of flies that formed words in the air before dissolving into laughter. When he spoke, his voice carried the wet sound of organs slowly dissolving into their component elements. "Another champion comes to test themselves against Grandfather's gifts," Typhus observed with grotesque pleasure. "How delicious, how perfectly inevitable. You will make fine additions to our garden once you have learned the joy that lies within decay." Sister Celestine raised her bolt pistol, but Kratos placed a gentle hand on her arm, staying her shot. There was something in his expression that spoke of depths of understanding she could not fathom. "You mistake suffering for wisdom," he said, addressing the Chaos Lord directly. "You celebrate the end of things as if it were their purpose. But death has meaning only when it preserves something greater than itself." Typhus laughed, and the sound made the very stones of the shrine weep black tears. "Spoken like one who has never truly understood loss, I offer eternal peace through acceptance of inevitable ending. What can you offer that compares to such mercy?" Kratos stepped forward, and with each pace, the air around him began to burn with golden fire that drove back the clouds of infection. "I offer choice," he said simply. "The choice to die well rather than live in degradation. The choice to make suffering meaningful rather than meaningless. The choice to resist corruption rather than embrace it." The battle that followed was unlike anything Sister Celestine had witnessed in 20 years of warfare. Kratos moved through the Death Guard like a force of nature, his blades of chaos carving through diseased flesh with surgical precision. But more than that, wherever he struck, the corruption seemed to burn away, not destroyed, but purified, returned to the clean emptiness from which all things grew. Typhus met him in the center of the shrine, his ancient power scythe weeping toxins that could have killed entire worlds. But Kratos caught the blade between his chained weapons and smiled with the satisfaction of a craftsman who had found exactly the right tool for the job. "Your grandfather teaches that suffering is inevitable," he said, as they strained against each other. "He is correct. But he lies when he claims that suffering has no purpose beyond itself. I have learned differently." The power of hope blazed forth again, but this time it carried with it something new. Not the desperate hope of the drowning man, but the patient hope of the gardener who plants seeds in winter, knowing that spring must eventually come. Where that light touched the corrupted shrine, decay stopped its advance and began, slowly, to reverse itself. Typhus screamed as his ancient armor began to crack, the diseases that had sustained him for 10 millennia suddenly finding themselves in conflict with something they could not corrupt or consume. Impossible! Grandfather's gifts are eternal. They cannot be. They can be endured, Kratos finished, and drove both blades through the herald's chest. And what can be endured can be overcome. The Death Guard champion fell like a toppled tree, his death sending ripples of confusion through the demon engines that had served him for centuries. One by one they began to shut down, their machine spirits no longer able to process commands from a master who had forgotten how to die with dignity. Sister Celestine stared at the cleansed shrine, at the golden light that now emanated from altars once devoted to corruption, and felt something she had not experienced since taking her final vows. "Wonder, how?" she whispered. "How did you do what blessed bolter shells and consecrated flamers could not?" Kratos turned to face her, and for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, his expression carried something that might have been peace. "I remembered what my daughter taught me," he said quietly. "That love is stronger than fear, that hope is more enduring than despair, and that sometimes the greatest mercy is simply to refuse to let others suffer alone." Above them, in the festering gardens of Nurgle's realm, the Plague Father stirred uneasily upon his throne of rot and ruin. For 70 million years, he had offered his gifts to those who could no longer bear the weight of existence, had shown them the peace that lay within acceptance of inevitable decay. But this warrior carried something that Nurgle could not understand, not the desperate hope that could be twisted into obsession, but the patient hope that found meaning in struggle itself. For the first time since his ascension, the Lord of Decay felt something that might have been uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, a single clean thought took root like a flower growing in fertile soil. What if there was another way? The question would haunt him through the wars to come, as the ghost of Sparta carved a path of purification through the very heart of his domain. Not destruction, but transformation, the kind of change that even Sinch could not have predicted or planned. The war for the souls of mortals had taken an unexpected turn, and even Chaos was beginning to wonder if it truly understood the nature of hope. The journey to Euphrates Quintus took 3 days through the tortured space where the great rift had torn reality asunder. Sister Superior Celestine stood beside Kratos at the observation deck of the commandeered transport, watching stars that burned in colors that had no names dance through the void like drunken angels. She had said little since departing the cleansed garden world, but her silence carried weight, the contemplative quiet of a warrior reassessing everything she thought she knew about duty and faith. "You did not destroy them," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the ship's reactor hum. "The Death Guard, the corrupted shrine. You purified them, rather than simply burning them away. That is not how the Imperium fights chaos." Kratos continued his vigil at the window, his burning gaze fixed upon the cosmic madness beyond. Your Imperium fights as if corruption is a stain that can only be cleansed with fire. But corruption is a choice, and choices can be reconsidered." "Heresy," Celestine whispered, but there was no condemnation in her voice, only confusion, and perhaps the first stirring of something that might have been hope. "The Codex Astartes, the Lectitio Divinitatus, every sacred text teaches that chaos cannot be redeemed. It can only be destroyed." "I have heard such certainties before," Kratos replied, and for a moment his reflection in the armored glass looked less like a warrior and more like a teacher whose students had disappointed him. Zeus proclaimed that his rule was eternal and just. Ares claimed that war was the highest virtue. Athena insisted that wisdom could justify any cruelty. They were all wrong. Before Celestine could respond, the ship's voxcasters crackled to life with a priority signal from the bridge. "Contact," came the voice of Navigator Priscilla. Her words strained with effort. "Imperial distress beacon. Coordinates match the agri-world of Euphrates Quintus. But the signature is wrong. Beautiful. Too beautiful." They found the world wreathed in aurora that painted the void in shades of ecstasy. What had once been a simple farming planet dedicated to feeding the hive worlds of the sector now pulsed with a rhythm that spoke to the deepest desires of any soul that beheld it. Cities had grown like living sculptures, their spires reaching toward the stars with the desperate hunger of flowers seeking sunlight. Between them, fields of impossible crops swayed in winds that carried music and promised fulfillment for every need that had ever gone unsatisfied. "Slanesh," Celestine breathed, her hand instinctively moving toward her bolt pistol. "The Prince of Pleasure has claimed this world for his own." As their Thunderhawk descended toward the planetary capital, they passed through layers of atmosphere that tasted of honey and wine, and dreams made manifest. The city below was a masterwork of architecture dedicated to sensation itself. Buildings that curved and twisted in patterns that pleased the eye beyond reason. Streets paved with crystals that sang with each footstep. Fountains that sprayed perfumes so intoxicating that merely breathing them induced visions of perfect bliss. It was the most beautiful place either of them had ever seen. It was utterly damned. They sat down in a plaza, where statues of perfect human forms danced in frozen rapture around a central fountain that wept tears of liquid starlight. The air shimmered with possibilities, and even through his blessed power armor, Kratos could feel the subtle whispers that promised everything he had ever wanted. Glory without the bitter taste of victory. Love without the fear of loss. Purpose without the weight of consequence. Sister Celestine staggered as they disembarked, her enhanced constitution struggling against influences that bypassed the physical entirely. "I can hear them," she whispered, her voice tight with strain. "Voices promising things I shouldn't want. Things that go against everything I have sworn to uphold." Kratos placed a steadying hand on her armored shoulder, and the touch seemed to ground her in reality once more. "The Dark Prince feeds upon desire itself," he said quietly. "But desire without discipline is merely hunger wearing a prettier mask." They found the first survivors in what had once been the governor's palace, now transformed into a pleasure dome, where reality bent like heated glass to accommodate every possible sensation. Imperial nobles who had once governed with stern rectitude now wallowed in pools of liquid ecstasy, their minds so overwhelmed by pleasure that they had forgotten how to feel anything else. Servants and masters alike had become creatures of pure appetite, feeding endlessly upon experiences that grew more extreme with each passing moment. In the palace's center, upon a throne carved from a single piece of crystallized desire, sat a figure that hurt to perceive directly. The Keeper of Secrets was beauty incarnate and corruption absolute. Its form shifted between idealized masculine and feminine perfection, its forearms ending in claws that could caress or kill with equal skill. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made the listener's bones sing with sympathetic vibration. "Welcome, Godslayer," the demon purred, its words dripping with honeyed venom. "I am Luxuria, herald of the Prince of Pleasure, and I have been expecting you. My lord has shown me such wonders about your past, your pain, your desperate hunger for what was stolen from you." The throne room shimmered, and suddenly Kratos stood not in a palace of corruption, but in a home he remembered from better days. Lysandra waited for him by the window, her face radiant with the joy of early morning. Calliope played at her feet, building impossible towers from blocks that defied gravity, through the simple faith of a child's imagination. "My love," Lysandra said, her voice exactly as he remembered it, carrying no trace of the accusations that had haunted his dreams for centuries. "You have been gone so long. Come home. Rest. Let the wars be fought by others for once." Calliope looked up from her toys and smiled with the innocent delight that had once been his entire world. "Papa, I've been waiting for you. Look what I built, a tower that reaches all the way to where the gods live. Now you don't have to fight them anymore. You can just visit." For a moment, Kratos felt his iron discipline waver. Here was everything he had lost, everything he had fought to avenge, everything he had mourned across the death of two entire pantheons. The demon was offering him not just their return, but a perfection that exceeded his memories, a version of his family that would never know pain or loss, or the bitter taste of duty that demanded sacrifice. "Beautiful, is it not?" Luxuria whispered, its voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "In my lord's realm, death is merely another sensation to be explored and discarded. Your family need not remain dead. They could live again, love again, laugh again, all for the simple price of abandoning this pointless crusade against forces greater than yourself." Sister Celestine watched in horror as Kratos took a step toward the false vision, his hand reaching out toward phantoms that wore the faces of his greatest grief. For a moment, she saw what she had glimpsed during their battle with Nurgle's forces. Not the implacable god-killer, but a father who had lost everything and spent lifetimes trying to make that loss meaningful. But then Kratos' expression changed, hardening into something that even the demon found disturbing. His reaching hand clenched into a fist, and when he spoke, his voice carried the finality of a gravestone inscription. "No." The word fell like a hammer blow upon the demon's perfect illusion. The false home shattered like glass, revealing the corruption that lay beneath. Where Lysandra had stood, a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes sought to maintain the deception. Where Calliope had played, a cluster of demon spawn sang lullabies of madness. "You offer me shadows," Kratos said, his voice cutting through the demon's shriek of frustration. "Echoes of what was, dressed in the promise of what could never be. I have learned the difference between love and possession, between remembrance and obsession." The Keeper of Secrets rose from its throne, all pretense of seduction falling away to reveal the predator beneath. "Impossible. All mortals desire. All can be tempted. What are you that you can simply refuse?" Kratos smiled, and the expression carried more menace than any threat. "I am someone who has learned that the dead are meant to rest in peace, not dance for the entertainment of the living. My family lives in my memory, in the choices I make, in the hope that others might be spared the pain I have known. That is enough." The battle that followed, shook the very foundations of the pleasure palace. Emperors' children emerged from hidden alcoves, their baroque armor gleaming with the patina of 10,000 perfect murders. They moved with inhuman grace, each gesture a study in lethal artistry, each strike calculated to inflict maximum aesthetic impact. But Kratos fought with something they could not understand, not the pursuit of perfect technique, but the grim efficiency of necessary violence. Where they sought beauty in death, he delivered only justice. Where they savored each moment of combat like wine, he ended conflicts with the straightforward brutality of a craftsman, completing a distasteful but necessary task. Sister Celestine fought beside him, her bolt pistol barking hymns of righteous fury, her power sword carving through corrupted flesh with the certainty of faith made manifest. She watched in amazement as Kratos faced temptations that would have broken the will of a living saint, and simply endured them. When a Noise Marine's sonic weapons promised perfect harmony through surrender, he pressed forward through the pain. When a Chaos Lord offered him command of legions in exchange for bending the knee, he answered with the blades of chaos. "Why?" Celestine shouted over the din of battle, her voice tight with confusion and growing admiration. "Why do you resist what any mortal would consider paradise?" Kratos parried a power sword that sang lullabies of eternal bliss and responded with a strike that sent its wielder's head spinning across the throne room. "Because paradise that requires the suffering of others is not paradise," he replied simply. "It is merely another form of tyranny." Luxuria screamed as the power of hope blazed forth once again, burning away illusions and false promises with the simple truth that some things were worth preserving unchanged. The demon's perfect form began to crack, revealing the hollow hunger that lay beneath all of Slanesh's gifts. "This is not possible," the Keeper of Secrets wailed as its carefully crafted reality dissolved into component lies. "Pleasure is the highest truth. Sensation is the only real experience. Without desire, what is the point of existence?" "To serve something greater than yourself," Kratos answered, and drove both blades through the demon's crystalline heart. To choose suffering for a purpose rather than pleasure for its own sake. To love something enough to let it remain pure rather than corrupt it with your need. The demon's death shriek shattered every crystal in the palace, and its destruction sent ripples through the warp that reached even to the hidden depths where Slanesh held court. For the first time since achieving godhood, the Prince of Pleasure felt something it had never experienced: genuine rejection. Not the false modesty that could be overcome with greater temptation, but absolute refusal based on principles that could not be negotiated. As the palace crumbled around them, Celestine and Kratos led the surviving imperial citizens to safety. Those who had not fallen too deeply into corruption stumbled through the ruins like sleepwalkers waking from beautiful dreams, their faces marked by the peculiar mixture of relief and loss that came from escaping a gilded cage. "You saved them," Celestine said, as they watched the refugees board evacuation transports. "But you also saved yourself. I have never seen anyone face the full temptation of the Dark Prince and simply walk away." Kratos watched the freed slaves with eyes that carried depths of understanding she was only beginning to fathom. "I learned long ago that the dead cannot be brought back by gods who would use their memory as chains. My family's love was real because it was freely given. Any echo of that love obtained through coercion or corruption would dishonor everything they meant to me." Sister Celestine studied his profile in the dying light of the burning palace, and for the first time since taking her final vows, she found herself questioning not her faith, but the limitations that had been placed upon it. Here was a warrior who fought not just against chaos, but for something positive, not merely destroying corruption, but offering a better way to those who had lost hope. "The ecclesiarchy teaches that we must hate the heretic," she said quietly. "That mercy toward the fallen is weakness that enables further corruption." "Sometimes," Kratos replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "the greatest mercy is to show others that they have choices they did not know existed. Fear can motivate for a time, but hope endures. Above them, in the realm of perfect sensation and endless appetite, Slanesh writhed upon its throne of crystallized desire. The Prince of Pleasure had offered this mortal everything it could conceive of: perfect love, infinite pleasure, eternal beauty, and had been rejected, not with struggle or reluctance, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already found something better. For the first time in its existence, the youngest of the Chaos gods began to understand what Tzeentch and Nurgle had discovered in their own encounters with the ghost of Sparta. This being was not merely resistant to corruption, it was antithetical to it. Where the ruinous powers sought to bind mortals with their desires, he offered them the freedom to choose something greater than themselves. The four gods who had feasted upon the galaxy's pain for 60 million years began to truly coordinate their efforts, not because they had overcome their eternal rivalries, but because they faced something that threatened the very foundation of their existence: the idea that mortals could choose virtue over vice, hope over despair, love over appetite. The real war was about to begin, and for the first time since the war in heaven, Chaos was afraid. The Librarium, Hereticus of the unflinching resolve, contained knowledge that most imperial citizens would consider blasphemous simply to acknowledge. Techmarines and lexicanums had died to gather the forbidden texts that lined its ceramite walls, treatises on warp topology written by madmen, star charts of impossible regions mapped by navigators who had paid for their knowledge with their sanity, and theoretical frameworks for understanding entities that existed beyond the boundaries of rational thought. Sister Superior Celestine stood beside Kratos in the chamber's center, her power armor's machine spirit whimpering with unease at the proximity to so much forbidden knowledge. Around them, servitor scribes clicked and whirred as they processed data streams that would have driven unaugmented minds to madness within moments. The Chaos gods exist primarily within the Immaterium, Magos Explorator Thaddeus intoned, his vox grill crackling with static as his cogitator implants struggled to process concepts that violated several laws of physics. What you have faced thus far are merely manifestations, shadows cast into real space by entities whose true forms transcend dimensional boundaries. Kratos studied the hololithic displays that showed the warp's twisted geography, regions where cause preceded effect, where thought became substance, where the fundamental constants of reality bent like heated metal. He had walked in similar realms before, had challenged gods in their own domains, but this was different. The Immaterium was not simply another plane of existence, but the collective unconscious of every sentient being in the galaxy, given form and malevolent will. To truly destroy them, the Magos continued, his mechadendrites writhing with barely contained excitement, one would need to enter their realm directly. But such a journey has never been successfully undertaken by any being save the Emperor himself, and he required the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily simply to maintain a beacon in the material realm. I have walked in the domains of gods before, Kratos said quietly, his gaze fixed upon a display that showed the approximate location of Khorne's brass citadel. Zeus ruled from Olympus, Odin held court in Asgard. Both thought themselves safe in their celestial fortresses. Both were wrong. Inquisitor Vex emerged from the shadows where he had been observing, his augmetic eye whirring as it processed the implications of what he had just heard. You speak of entering the warp itself. Not a brief transit or a minor incursion, but a deliberate journey into the heart of chaos. The risks are incalculable. As was challenging the king of the gods, Kratos replied, with the calm certainty of someone who had already accepted the price of his choices. Yet Zeus fell. If these four would call themselves divine, they must face the consequences of that claim. Sister Celestine felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized what the god-killer was proposing. "You mean to go alone?" she said, and it was not a question. "Into the realm where madness takes physical form, and reality bends to the will of beings who have feasted on galactic suffering for millions of years." Kratos turned to face her, and for the first time since they had met, his expression carried something that might have been regret. "I have brought enough suffering to those who chose to follow me. This path leads only to damnation or death, and I will not see you walk it, simply because you believe it is your duty." The words struck her like a physical blow, not because they carried cruelty, but because they carried truth. She had spent 20 years in service to the Emperor, had faced demons and heretics across a dozen sectors, had never questioned that her duty was to follow wherever the path of righteousness led. But this warrior had shown her something she had never expected to find. Genuine concern for her welfare that came not from duty or regulation, but from something deeper. "My duty," she said carefully, "is not simply to follow orders or recite catechisms. My duty is to serve the Emperor's will, and his will is that humanity be protected from the predations of chaos. If you can truly destroy these entities, then helping you is not just my duty. It is the greatest service I could possibly offer." "And if I fail?" Kratos asked, his voice carrying depths of pain that spoke of other companions lost to hopeless causes. "If I am corrupted or destroyed, and you are trapped forever in a realm where suffering is currency and despair is sustenance." Celestine met his burning gaze without flinching, and when she spoke, her words carried the iron certainty of a faith that had been tested and refined in the crucible of genuine understanding. "Then I will have failed serving a cause I chose freely, rather than succeeded serving one imposed upon me by fear." The ghost of Sparta studied her face for a long moment, seeing in her features the same stubborn courage that had driven him to defy Zeus despite knowing the cost. She would not be dissuaded, he realized, any more than he could be turned from his path by the promise of easy victories or comfortable compromises. "Very well," he said finally, "but if we do this, it must be done properly. I will not enter the warp as a supplicant or a refugee. I will go as what I am, a killer of gods, come to collect a debt that has been too long unpaid." They found the knowledge they needed in the deepest vaults of the librarium, in texts that had been sealed since the dark days of the Age of Strife. Inquisitor Lord Hector Voss had spent 3 centuries studying forbidden warp lore, seeking ways to strike directly at the heart of chaos rather than merely containing its manifestations. His research had cost him his sanity, his soul, and ultimately his life, but the fruits of his madness remained encoded in data crystals that pulsed with their own malevolent light. "The ritual of absolute transgression," Magos Thaddeus whispered as he decoded the final sequences, his voice modulator struggling to pronounce words that predated human speech. Voss believed it could create a stable rift into the warp's deepest layers. Not a random breach that might cast the traveler anywhere in the immaterium, but a directed passage to specific coordinates within Chaos's domain. "What is the price?" Kratos asked, because he had learned long ago that gods and their servants never offered anything without demanding payment. "The ritual requires a focus," the Magos replied, his mechadendrites writhing with unease. "Something that has already been touched by all 4 chaos gods and survived unchanged. Something that carries the essence of absolute defiance against divine authority." Kratos smiled grimly and extended his hand, palm upward. Slowly, the blades of chaos materialized in the chamber's sanctified air, their chains wreathed in flames that cast no shadows. The weapons had been forged in Hades itself, had drunk the blood of titans and gods alike, had been wielded in defiance of every pantheon he had encountered. If anything in this galaxy could serve as a focus for such a ritual, it would be the instruments of his divine rebellion. "These will suffice," he said simply. The ritual itself took 3 days to prepare, and mere moments to execute. Ancient geometries were carved into the floor of the ship's chapel, their angles designed to create spaces that technically should not exist within 3-dimensional reality. Servo skulls chanted litanies in languages that had been old when Terra was young, while tech priests made offerings of blessed machine oil and sanctified promethium to appease the ship's increasingly agitated machine spirits. On the final night, as the unflinching resolve held position at the edge of the great rift's influence, Kratos stood alone in the chapel's center and felt the weight of what he was about to attempt. He had challenged gods before, but never in their own realm, never with stakes that encompassed entire galaxies of innocent life. If he failed here, if he was corrupted or destroyed, then the Chaos gods would learn from his attempt and become even more entrenched in their tyranny. Sister Celestine found him there, kneeling not in prayer but in contemplation, his hands resting on the weapons that had defined his existence for longer than some civilizations had endured. "Doubts?" she asked quietly, settling beside him with the easy familiarity of a warrior who had learned to find peace in the moments before battle. "Always," Kratos admitted, and the honesty in his voice surprised them both. "I have failed before, Celestine. I have lost those I sought to protect, have seen my choices lead to suffering that exceeded what I tried to prevent. What if I am wrong? What if there is no victory to be won here, only different forms of defeat?" She studied his profile in the chapel's candlelight, seeing not the implacable god-killer, but a being who had carried the weight of impossible choices for far too long. "Then you will have tried," she said simply. "And sometimes trying is enough. Sometimes the act of resistance itself changes what is possible." When the ritual began, reality screamed. The carved geometries blazed with light that existed in colors beyond the visible spectrum, while the blades of chaos rose into the air and began to spin like the axes of some impossible clockwork. The ship's Geller field generators howled as they struggled to contain energies that violated every law of physics, and throughout the vessel, machine spirits wailed in electronic anguish as they felt the approach of forces that predated their creation. At the ritual's climax, Kratos rose and grasped the spinning blades, feeling their chains bite into his palms as divine power flowed through the weapons and into the carefully prepared matrix of forbidden knowledge. The air before him split like rotten fruit, revealing not the simple darkness of empty space, but something far more terrible. A wound in reality itself that showed glimpses of realms where thought became substance and emotion took physical form. "I go now to face the gods of this galaxy," he said, his voice carrying across the chapel, despite the howling winds that poured from the rift. "If I do not return, remember that I chose this path freely, and that choice has meaning, even if it ends in failure." Sister Celestine stepped forward, her hand moving to the bolt pistol at her side. "No," she said firmly. "We go now to face the gods, together." Kratos turned to protest, to argue that he would not see another companion sacrificed for his vendetta. But the words died in his throat when he saw her expression. This was not the blind obedience of a fanatic, or the desperate courage of someone with nothing left to lose. This was the calm determination of a warrior who had found something worth fighting for, and would not be denied the chance to defend it. "The Emperor protects," she said, stepping toward the rift with her weapon drawn, and her faith burning like a star in the darkness. "Hope endures," Kratos replied, and together they stepped through the wound in reality, into the heart of chaos itself. Behind them, the rift sealed with a sound like breaking worlds, leaving only the echo of their passage and the faint hope that when gods next walked among mortals, they would do so in chains rather than crowns. The real war had begun, and for the first time in 60 million years, the Chaos Gods would face an enemy in their own realm who had come not to bargain or beg, but to see them answer for their crimes against the innocent. In the depths of the warp, ancient powers stirred upon thrones of bone and brass and crystal and flesh, no longer certain that their dominion was absolute or their victory assured. The ghost of Sparta had come home. The brass citadel rose from the crimson plains of Khorne's domain like a monument to every act of violence committed since the birth of consciousness. Its towers scraped against a sky that bled perpetual twilight, while its walls echoed with the screams of warriors locked in eternal combat. Here, in the heart of the blood god's realm, the very concept of peace was heresy punishable by dissolution into component fury. Kratos and Sister Celestine materialized at the citadel's base, their forms solidifying from the raw stuff of thought and will that comprised the Immaterium's foundation. The transition from real space had been agony. Every memory of violence, every moment of rage, every drop of blood they had ever spilled suddenly became tangible forces pressing against their consciousness like red-hot brands. But where lesser mortals would have been driven mad by the psychic pressure, both warriors found themselves strengthened by it. Kratos' fury was not the mindless berserker rage that Khorne fed upon, but something far more dangerous. Anger given purpose, violence made meaningful through the pursuit of justice. Celestine's faith burned like a star in the darkness, her devotion to the Emperor creating a bubble of sanctity that even the blood god's domain couldn't fully penetrate. "It is beautiful," she whispered, and there was horror in her voice as she recognized the terrible truth of her words. The citadel was beautiful, a perfect expression of martial might, unconstrained by mercy or hesitation. Every angle spoke of efficiency and slaughter. Every decoration celebrated the artistry of war. It was everything that a warrior's paradise should be, and that was precisely what made it damned. The first wave of defenders came like a crimson tide across the brass plains, bloodletters in their thousands, their demon-forged blades singing hymns of slaughter, their bestial faces twisted with the ecstasy of eternal warfare. Behind them loped flesh hounds, their supernatural senses tracking the scent of mortal souls like bloodhounds following a trail of gore. Above, bloodthirsters wheeled on wings of shadow and flame, their axes crackling with the accumulated fury of 10 million battlefields. Kratos smiled, and the expression carried more menace than 1,000 threats. "Finally," he said, drawing the blades of chaos with movements that had been refined across eons of divine warfare. "A honest fight." What followed was not battle but apocalypse. Kratos carved through the demon hordes like a scythe through wheat, each strike of his blades severing not just flesh but the very concept that gave the creature's form. In real space, destroying a demon's physical manifestation merely banished it back to the warp. Here, in the realm of pure thought and emotion, his weapons cut deeper, unmaking the fury and hatred that comprised their essential nature. Sister Celestine fought beside him with the precision of a master artisan, her bolt pistol barking hymns of faith, while her power sword carved arcs of golden fire through the demon ranks. Her presence in this realm of pure violence was an anomaly that caused reality to ripple around her. Where she walked, the brass beneath her feet showed patches of silver, as if her faith were slowly transforming the very substance of Khorne's domain. With each daemon that fell, Kratos felt the blood god's attention focus more intently upon him. The citadel's towers rang like bells as Khorne's rage built to levels that made stars tremble in their courses. The god who had feasted upon galactic violence for 60 million years was watching his servants die, not in glorious combat, but in purposeful execution, and the distinction filled him with something he had not felt since his ascension: uncertainty. The throne room lay at the citadel's heart, accessed through gates of brazen bone that bore the skulls of every champion who had ever dared challenge the blood god's supremacy. The chamber beyond stretched farther than cathedrals, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows that writhed with the screams of the damned. At its center sat a throne carved from a single mountain of skulls, each one polished to mirror brightness, each one reflecting a different moment of perfect violence. Upon that throne sat Khorne himself. The blood god was beauty and terror made manifest. 8 feet of perfect warrior physique, clad in armor that had been forged in the first moments of the galaxy's birth. His face bore the cruel perfection of a predator who had never known defeat, while his eyes burned with fires that had consumed entire civilizations. In his hands he held an axe whose edge had tasted the blood of gods and found it sweet. "So," Khorne rumbled, his voice like the sound of worlds cracking under the weight of endless war. "The god-killer comes at last to my domain. I have watched your progress with interest, mortal. Your rage burns bright, your skill is undeniable, your purpose clear. Join me, and together we shall bring order to this galaxy through the simple truth of superior force." Kratos advanced through the throne room with measured steps, his gaze never leaving the blood god's burning eyes. "I have heard such offers before," he said calmly. "Ares made similar promises when he sought to use me as his instrument. I gave him the same answer I give you." "And what answer is that?" Khorne asked, rising from his throne with movements that made the very air catch fire. "No." The blood god's laughter shook the foundations of his citadel, sending tremors through the warp that manifested as earthquakes across a dozen star systems. "You think to deny me? I am war incarnate. I am the first murder, the last battle, the eternal truth that only strength matters. I have feasted upon the fury of Primarchs and drunk deeply from the rage of entire civilizations." "You are a parasite," Kratos replied, with the calm certainty of absolute truth. "You feed upon the nobility of warriors and corrupt it into mindless slaughter. You turn the protector's strength into the tyrant's cruelty. You are everything that I have spent eternity fighting against." The battle that erupted between them would have destroyed lesser realities. Khorne's axe carved through the air with the force of collapsing suns, while Kratos's blades wove patterns of destruction that had been perfected in the forges of Mount Olympus. Where their weapons clashed, space itself cracked, revealing glimpses of the void that existed before thought or emotion had given birth to gods. But as the fight progressed, it became clear that this was no ordinary contest of strength. In the material universe, Kratos was mighty but still bound by the laws of physics. Here, in the realm of pure concept and ideal, he fought not just as a warrior, but as an embodiment of righteous vengeance itself. Every blow he struck carried the weight of every innocent he had failed to save, every child orphaned by divine indifference, every mortal who had suffered because gods thought themselves above consequence. Khorne fought with the accumulated fury of 60 million years, his every strike powered by the rage of civilizations, ground beneath the heel of endless war. But there was a difference between his anger and Kratos's. The blood god's rage was consumption without purpose, destruction for its own sake. Kratos's fury burned with the focused intensity of a blade being forged, every ounce of his wrath directed toward the singular goal of seeing justice done. "Impossible!" Khorne snarled as Kratos's blades carved through his perfect armor, drawing ichor that steamed like molten brass. "I am eternal. I am inevitable. As long as mortals know anger, I cannot be destroyed." "Perhaps," Kratos admitted, ducking beneath a blow that would have split mountains and responding with a strike that opened the god's thigh to the bone. "But you can be hurt. You can be humbled. You can be taught that power without purpose is merely another form of weakness." The climax came when Khorne, driven by rage beyond reason, attempted to crush his opponent through sheer divine will. The blood god's presence expanded, filling the throne room with such concentrated fury that the brass walls began to melt like candles. But Kratos met that overwhelming force not with his own rage, but with something far more dangerous. The power of hope, refined through eons of struggle into something that could burn even gods. The golden light erupted from his form like a newborn star, and where it touched Khorne's overwhelming presence, the god's fury simply stopped. Not destroyed, but transformed, turned from mindless destruction into something that might serve a higher purpose. For the first time since his ascension, the blood god felt his absolute certainty waver. In that moment of doubt, Kratos struck. Both blades pierced Khorne's chest, driving deep into the god's divine essence. The blood god screamed, and the sound of it sent shockwaves through the immaterium that manifested as supernovas in distant galaxies. Divine ichor sprayed across the throne room, each drop containing enough concentrated violence to level continents. But the wounds, grievous as they were, did not destroy the blood god. They could not. Khorne was more than flesh, more than form. He was the living embodiment of rage itself, and as long as mortals knew anger, some aspect of him would endure. "This is not possible," Khorne gasped, his perfect features twisted with pain and something that might have been fear. "I am eternal. You are wounded," Kratos finished, withdrawing his blades and watching as the blood god staggered backward toward his throne. "You are diminished. You are no longer invincible in the eyes of those who serve you. That is enough." Khorne collapsed upon his throne of skulls, divine essence leaking from wounds that would take eons to heal properly. For the first time since the war in heaven, the mightiest of the chaos gods had been brought low by a mortal hand. Around the citadel, demon armies began to dissolve as their patron's weakened state left them unable to maintain coherent form. "This changes nothing," Khorne wheezed, but there was no conviction in his voice. "The others will destroy you. Tzeentch's schemes, Nurgle's inevitability, Slanesh's seduction, they will succeed where I have failed." Kratos turned away from the diminished god, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a craftsman who had completed necessary work. Perhaps. But now they know they can be hurt. Now they know they are not beyond consequence. That knowledge will spread through the warp like wildfire, and your followers will begin to question whether gods who can bleed are truly worthy of worship. Sister Celestine, who had watched the impossible battle in awed silence, found her voice at last. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually wounded a chaos god in his own realm. I saw it, but I can barely comprehend it." "This is only the beginning," Kratos replied, but there was grim satisfaction in his voice. 3 gods remain, and each will be more cunning than the last. But Korna was the strongest, the most direct in his power. If he can be humbled, then the others can be as well. As they prepared to leave the broken citadel, reality around them began to shift and change. The brass city's perfect geometries started to crack, allowing glimpses of other realms to bleed through. In the distance, they could hear the sound of debate, voices that belonged to beings of unimaginable power, discussing strategies and making alliances that had been unthinkable just moments before. The 3 remaining Chaos gods were no longer content to watch and wait. Khorne's defeat had proven that the ghost of Sparta was more than an anomaly. He was an existential threat to their very existence. For the first time since the war in heaven, they would work in true coordination, setting aside eons of rivalry in the face of a common enemy. But as they departed the wounded god's domain, Kratos allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The first blow had been struck, the first divine blood spilled. The Chaos gods were no longer invincible in the eyes of those who served them, and that crack in their armor would only grow wider with each passing moment. The war for the galaxy's soul had truly begun, and for the first time in 60 million years, Chaos had reason to fear. The transition from Khorne's brass domain to Tzeentch's crystalline realm was like stepping from a furnace into a kaleidoscope. Where the blood god's territory had been brutally honest in its celebration of violence, the Changer of Ways had crafted a dimension that existed in a constant state of flux. Impossible geometries folded in upon themselves, creating corridors that led simultaneously forward and backward through time. Stairways climbed toward destinations that changed with each footstep, while doorways opened onto rooms that contained entire universes or perfect vacuums with equal probability. Sister Celestine stumbled as reality shifted beneath her feet, the marble beneath her boots transforming into crystal, then water, then pure mathematics before settling into something that resembled glass, but felt like silk. "How do we navigate this madness?" she whispered, her power armor's machine spirit whimpering as it struggled to process sensor readings that violated every law of physics. Kratos stood unmoving in the center of the shifting chaos, his burning gaze fixed upon a point in the middle distance that seemed to exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. "We don't," he said simply. "We ignore it." The ghost of Sparta began walking forward in a straight line, paying no attention to the walls that rose to block his path, or the floors that opened into bottomless pits beneath his feet. Where his will met Tzeentch's reality-bending power, something extraordinary happened. The god's elaborate constructs simply failed to take hold, not destroyed, but dismissed, treated as irrelevant by a mind that had learned to see past divine deception. "Fascinating," came a voice that spoke in colors and tasted of forbidden knowledge. "Most visitors spend eternity wandering my labyrinth, seeking the perfect path through puzzles that have no solution. Yet you simply refuse to acknowledge their existence. How delightfully primitive." Tzeentch materialized before them in a form that hurt to perceive directly. Part eagle, part serpent, part geometric impossibility that existed in more dimensions than human consciousness could process. Its feathers were inscribed with equations that described the probability of every choice never made, while its eyes reflected futures that could be, but would not be. When it spoke, the words rearranged themselves in the air before reaching their ears, each sentence a puzzle that required careful interpretation. "I am the architect of fate," the god continued, its voice carrying harmonics that made reality ripple like water. "I have spent eons weaving the threads of possibility into tapestries of inevitable outcome. Primarchs have danced to my orchestrations. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen according to my designs. What makes you think you can simply walk through schemes that predate your birth by millions of years?" Kratos stopped his inexorable advance and studied the shape-shifting deity with the patient attention of a craftsman evaluating a particularly complex piece of work. "Because I have met your kind before," he said calmly. "The Fates believed they controlled destiny through the manipulation of possibility. Athena thought wisdom gave her the right to determine what choices mortals could make. They were wrong." The crystal labyrinth around them began to shift more rapidly as Tzeentch's irritation grew. Walls became ceilings, became floors, became mathematical concepts that existed only in the spaces between thoughts. The god's domain was reacting to its master's emotions, creating increasingly elaborate puzzles and paradoxes designed to trap the intruders in loops of recursive logic. "You compare me to lesser deities?" Tzeentch shrieked, its form cycling through 1,000 different configurations of impossible beauty. "I am change incarnate. I am the force that drives evolution and revolution. I am the mind behind every plot, the author of every scheme. To oppose me is to oppose the very concept of progress." "You are stagnation wearing the mask of change," Kratos replied, continuing his straight-line march through reality-defying obstacles. "True change comes from within, from choices freely made. You offer only the illusion of choice while pulling the strings that determine every outcome. You are not progress. You are the death of free will, disguised as its champion." Sister Celestina watched in amazement as Kratos' simple rejection of Tzeentch's reality began to have visible effects on the labyrinth itself. Where the god-killer walked, the impossible geometries started to crack, revealing glimpses of something simpler underneath. The endless spirals and recursive loops began to unwind, as if his straightforward nature was forcing the realm to remember what logic actually looked like. Tzeentch attempted to bind them with increasingly complex puzzles, rooms where the only exit required solving equations that described the nature of existence itself, corridors that demanded they choose between futures that all led to damnation, chambers where progress could only be made by accepting paradoxes that violated the fundamental laws of causality. But Kratos had learned something in his wars against the gods that served him well now. Sometimes the most sophisticated trap could be defeated by the simple expedient of refusing to play the game. Where Tzeentch offered complex choices, he chose the direct path. Where the god presented elaborate puzzles, he provided simple solutions. Where the changer of ways demanded intellectual engagement with its schemes, he offered only the focused determination of someone who had found his purpose and would not be distracted from it. "This is impossible," Tzeentch raged as another section of its perfect labyrinth crumbled into geometric simplicity. "You cannot simply ignore the fundamental nature of reality, cause and effect, action and consequence, the intricate web of possibility that connects all things." "I can," Kratos said, and reached out to grasp one of the god's constantly shifting forms, "because I have learned that complexity is often just another word for confusion, and confusion serves only those who profit from others' inability to see clearly." The moment his hands closed around the changer of ways substance, the power of hope blazed forth with an intensity that made their previous encounters seem like candle flames. But this time, the golden light carried something new, the crystalline clarity of purpose refined through eons of struggle. Where it touched Tzeentch's ever-shifting form, the god's mutations stopped, locked into a single configuration for the first time since its ascension. "No," Tzeentch whispered, staring at its own hands as they remained constant for more than a nanosecond. "This cannot be. I am eternal change. I am infinite possibility. I am—" "You are afraid," Kratos finished, and began to squeeze. The battle that followed was unlike anything either combatant had experienced. Where Kratos' fight with Khorne had been a contest of physical might and righteous fury, this was a war between opposing philosophies given lethal form. Tzeentch struck with spells that rewrote the laws of physics, cast sorceries that turned cause and effect into meaningless concepts, hurled paradoxes that should have unraveled the god-killer's very existence. But Kratos met each attack with something the Changer of Ways could not understand or counter: absolute certainty. His purpose was simple. Gods who claimed dominion over mortals must be held accountable for their actions. His method was direct. Find the god, challenge the god, destroy or humble the god. His will was unshakable. No amount of complexity could disguise the fundamental truth that power without justice was merely tyranny with better public relations. The blades of chaos moved in patterns that seemed almost primitive compared to Tzeentch's reality-bending assaults, but they carried something that all the gods' sophistication could not match: the focused intent of someone who knew exactly what he was fighting for. Where they struck, the Changer of Ways' perfect schemes cracked like glass, revealing the hollow ambition that lay beneath all the elaborate plotting. "You offer mortals the illusion of choice while determining every outcome," Kratos said, as his blades carved through magical defenses that had withstood the assault of primarchs and demon princes. "You promise knowledge while delivering only confusion. You claim to serve progress while ensuring that change serves only your hunger for worship." Tzeentch screamed as the accusations struck home with more force than any physical blow. The gods' crystalline realm began to collapse around them, centuries of careful construction undone by the simple truth that its foundation had always been rotten. The impossible fortress, that monument to the power of Byzantine complexity, cracked from foundation to spire as something far more dangerous than brute force attacked its very concept. "I am the architect of fate," the god shrieked, its form cycling through increasingly desperate configurations as it sought one that could resist the god-killer's assault. "I have guided the destiny of galaxies. I have orchestrated the rise and fall of empires. You have failed," Kratos said simply, and drove both blades deep into the god's core. The golden light of hope erupted through Tzeentch's form like lightning through crystal, fracturing the deity's perfect complexity into something approaching honesty. For the first time since achieving godhood, the Changer of Ways experienced absolute clarity, the crystal-clear understanding of what it truly was and what it had become. The revelation was agony. Tzeentch had convinced itself that its manipulations served some greater purpose, that its schemes elevated mortals by forcing them to grow through adversity. But in this moment of enforced honesty, it saw the truth. It was not a teacher or guide, but a parasite that fed upon mortal ambition and dressed its hunger in the language of enlightenment. "This changes nothing," the wounded god gasped as it attempted to retreat deeper into its shattered realm. "I am eternal. I am inevitable. As long as mortals plan and scheme and hope for something better, I will endure." "Perhaps," Kratos acknowledged, withdrawing his blades and watching as cracks spread through the crystal labyrinth's walls. "But now you know what you truly are. That knowledge will eat at you like acid, making every scheme taste of ash and every plot feel hollow. You will endure, but you will never again believe your own lies about serving the greater good." Sister Celestine stared at the collapsing labyrinth in wonder, watching as eons of careful construction crumbled into geometric simplicity. "You didn't destroy him," she observed. "You did something worse. You made him see himself clearly." "Destroying a god is sometimes less effective than teaching them the cost of their choices," Kratos replied. "Tzeentch will survive, but its schemes will lack the certainty they once carried. Its followers will sense that doubt, and some will begin to question whether a god who questions itself is worthy of worship." As they prepared to depart the wounded god's domain, reality around them continued to shift and change. But now the transformations carried a different quality. Not the confident manipulations of absolute power, but the desperate flailings of something that had lost faith in its own purpose. Behind them, in the deepest chambers of the crystal labyrinth, Tzeentch huddled upon a throne of shattered possibilities and wept tears that tasted of bitter truth. For the first time in its existence, the Changer of Ways had been forced to see itself without the comforting illusions of its own propaganda, and the vision was almost more than it could bear. 2 gods wounded, 2 more to face, but already, across the breadth of the immaterium, diamonds were beginning to whisper words that had not been spoken in 60 million years. What if the gods were wrong? What if there was another way? The cracks in Chaos's foundation were spreading, and even the most elaborate schemes could not prevent the simple truth from taking root in fertile ground. The Garden of Nurgle stretched to the horizon like a fevered dream of paradise lost, where Tzeentch's realm had been crystalline perfection, and Khorne's domain brutal honesty. The Plague Father's territory was something far more insidious. Beauty made from corruption, peace found in decay, love expressed through the acceptance of inevitable ending. Ancient trees bore fruit that wept honey and pus in equal measure, their roots drinking deep from streams that carried the liquefied remains of every plague victim who had ever found solace in Nurgle's embrace. Sister Celestine retched as they materialized beside a pond that reflected not their faces, but their eventual decomposition, showing how they would look when time and entropy claimed their final victory. Her power armor's filters screamed warnings as they struggled against airborne pathogens that carried names in languages that predated human speech, yet somehow the corruption felt gentle, like the touch of a loving grandfather who sought only to ease the suffering of beloved grandchildren. "It is wrong," she whispered, her voice muffled by her helmet's emergency seals. "This place is utterly damned, yet it feels peaceful, as if all the pain and struggle could finally end here." Kratos stood unmoved beside her, his divine physiology adapting to toxins that would have reduced lesser beings to fertilizer within moments. But unlike his previous encounters with Chaos domains, he did not immediately advance toward the center of power. Something in this garden gave him pause, a complexity that demanded careful consideration rather than straightforward violence. "Nurgle is the most dangerous of the 4, he said quietly, watching as butterflies with wings of living disease landed on flowers that sang lullabies of eternal rest. Not because he is the strongest or most cunning, but because he offers genuine mercy alongside his corruption. The others seek to dominate through fear or desire. This one offers love." They walked deeper into the garden, along paths paved with the compressed remains of willing sacrifices, mortals who had chosen decay over despair, disease over abandonment, death over the endless struggle to survive in an uncaring universe. With each step, Kratos felt the garden's subtle influence attempting to work upon his consciousness, not through force or deception, but through the simple truth that all things must end, and endings could be beautiful if accepted with grace. The first souls they encountered were tending to a grove where plague trees grew in perfect spirals, their infected bark weeping tears of liquid amber that preserved the memories of every disease they had spread. The gardeners had once been imperial citizens, their forms now expanded and transformed by Nurgle's gifts, but their faces carried expressions of genuine contentment. Peace travelers, called one who had been a Hive-World manufacturing worker before plague claimed his lungs and gave him gills that breathed toxic spores like sweet air. Welcome to Grandfather's garden. Here there is no hunger, no want, no loneliness, only the eternal cycle of growth and decay, death and rebirth, suffering transformed into acceptance. Sister Celestina's hand moved instinctively toward her bolt pistol, but Kratos stayed her motion with a gentle touch. "Why did you choose this?" he asked the transformed soul, genuine curiosity in his voice. "What drove you to embrace corruption rather than fight against it?" The plague-bearer's face, what remained of it, creased with something that might have been a smile. "My children died first," he said simply. "Factory accident, toxic waste leak, corporate greed disguised as efficiency. I prayed to the Emperor, begged for justice, sought meaning in their suffering. But the only answer was more work, more production quotas, more indifference to the pain of the powerless." He gestured to the garden around them, where creatures that had once been his family played among flowers that bloomed with their shared diseases. "Grandfather Nurgle showed me that death is not an ending but a transformation. My children live again, changed but happy. Their suffering has meaning now. It feeds new growth, creates new life. Is that not better than simply forgetting them?" Kratos felt something cold settle in his chest as he recognized the terrible logic in the soul's words. This was not the mindless rage of Khorne's followers or the hollow ambition of Tzeentch's servants. This was a parent's love, perverted into something that served corruption, genuine compassion twisted until it enabled the very suffering it sought to end. They continued deeper into the garden, past groves where trees bore fruit, filled with beneficial bacteria that could cure any disease except the spiritual emptiness that had driven their cultivation. They walked beside streams where fish swam that had been human once, their transformation complete, but their consciousness intact, their minds filled with the peace that came from no longer struggling against the inevitable. At the garden's heart stood a cottage that seemed almost quaint despite being constructed from living bone and roofed with what appeared to be skin that breathed with its own rhythm. Before it sat the largest and most grotesque figure Kratos had ever beheld, Nurgle himself, the Plague Father, tending to a garden bed where he grew new diseases with the loving care of a master horticulturist. The god was vast beyond mortal comprehension, his bloated form containing multitudes of smaller creatures that lived in symbiotic harmony within his rotting flesh. His face, when he turned it toward them, was that of every grandfather who had ever comforted a crying child, kindly, patient, infinitely understanding. When he spoke, his voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had seen all suffering and learned to find meaning within it. "Kratos," Nurgle said, his tone carrying genuine pleasure at the meeting, "the god-killer himself, come to visit my humble garden. I have watched your progress with great interest, child. Such pain you carry, such burden. Yet you refuse the peace I offer. Continue to struggle against forces greater than yourself. Why do you choose suffering when acceptance would bring such rest? The ghost of Sparta studied the plague father for a long moment, seeing in that corrupted visage something that troubled him more than any threat or curse. Nergal was not lying about his compassion. The god genuinely believed that his gifts were mercy, that transformation through disease was preferable to the endless struggle of unaugmented existence. Because suffering has purpose only when it is chosen freely, Kratos replied carefully. You offer peace through surrender, meaning through transformation. But the choice to surrender is not truly free when the alternative is endless pain. You create the despair that makes your mercy seem appealing. Nergal's laughter was like the sound of autumn leaves falling on rich earth, warm and somehow comforting despite its source. Oh, my child, you misunderstand so much. I do not create despair. I simply offer solace to those who have already found it. Look around you. See how content my children are, how their suffering has been transformed into something beautiful. The god gestured to his garden, where countless souls tended to corrupted growths with expressions of genuine happiness. They came to me broken, abandoned, forgotten by those who claimed to love them. I gave them purpose, community, eternal life within the cycle of growth and decay. Is that not more merciful than leaving them to die, alone and unmourned? It would be, Kratos admitted, if you offered that solace without demanding the price of corruption in return. But you do not simply ease suffering, you perpetuate it. Every disease you spread, every plague you nurture, creates new despair that drives more souls to seek your mercy. You are not ending the cycle of pain. You are ensuring it continues forever. For the first time since their conversation began, something shifted in Nergal's expression, a flicker of uncertainty, a crack in the absolute certainty that had defined his existence for 60 million years. That is not, the god began, then trailed off as if encountering a concept he had never been forced to consider. You call yourself the Plague Father, Kratos continued, pressing his advantage with the relentless logic of someone who had spent eons examining his own justifications for violence. But a true father protects his children from suffering, not ensures they have no choice but to accept it. You have made yourself indispensable by creating the very conditions that make your services necessary. Sister Celestine watched in amazement as the conversation unfolded, realizing that this was unlike the god-killer's previous encounters. He was not seeking to destroy Nergal through force, or even to wound him through revelation. He was doing something far more subtle and potentially more devastating. He was forcing the god to examine whether his compassion was genuine or simply another form of selfishness, dressed in the language of mercy. I offer love, Nergal said, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Acceptance, community, an end to loneliness and despair. You offer dependence, Kratos countered, addiction disguised as affection. Your followers do not love you because you are worthy of love. They love you because you have made yourself the only source of relief from the suffering you help perpetuate. That is not compassion. That is exploitation. The garden around them began to shift and change as Nergal's absolute certainty wavered. Trees that had stood for eons started to sway without wind, their diseased fruit falling like tears to soil that suddenly seemed less fertile. The god's followers looked up from their tending with expressions of confusion, sensing something they had never felt before, doubt in their patron's benevolence. But the alternative, Nergal whispered, his vast form seeming to shrink as the full implications of Kratos' words sank home. The alternative is to let them suffer alone, to die forgotten, to find no meaning in their pain. The alternative, Kratos said gently, is to help them find strength to endure suffering without surrendering to it, to offer hope rather than despair, healing rather than comfortable corruption, love that asks for nothing in return rather than affection that demands eternal servitude. For the first time in his existence, the Plague Father began to weep. Not tears of toxic joy, but genuine sorrow as he confronted the possibility that his mercy might be another form of cruelty. Around the garden, some of his followers began to change, their diseased forms slowly healing as their patron's certainty in his own benevolence wavered. "I do not know if I can be what you describe," Nurgle admitted, his voice carrying the weight of eons spent believing he was offering the only kindness possible in a cruel universe. "I am what I am. I am corruption and decay, disease and despair transformed into acceptance." "You could choose to be something else," Kratos said, and for the first time since entering the warp, his voice carried something approaching gentleness. Not destroyed, but transformed. Not eliminated, but redeemed. Your followers need not be abandoned to suffer. They could be taught that suffering has meaning, even when it is not surrendered to. The conversation that followed would reshape the very nature of one of Chaos's fundamental forces. Not through violence or trickery, but through the simple power of one being helping another to see that the compassion they thought they offered might be improved, refined, made genuine rather than self-serving. In the depths of the warp, three gods felt their brother's certainty waver, and knew that the greatest threat they had ever faced was not the god-killer's strength or wisdom, but his capacity to offer hope even to those who had abandoned it long ago. The palace of Slaanesh rose before them, like a fever dream of impossible desires made manifest. But something was wrong. Where the Dark Prince's domain had once pulsed with confident hedonism, now it thrummed with desperate hunger. The very air tasted of fear, disguised as passion, of weakness, masked by displays of false strength. The god who had always been the most sophisticated of the four had become something far more dangerous. A cornered predator with nothing left to lose. Sister Celestine felt the change immediately, her enhanced senses recoiling from psychic emanations that spoke not of temptation, but of pure, undiluted need. "It's different," she whispered, her power armor's machine spirit whimpering as it detected energy signatures that defied every law of physics. "The prince is afraid, desperate. I can feel it bleeding through the warp itself." Kratos nodded grimly, his burning gaze fixed upon the palace's twisted spires. In his previous encounters with each god, he had faced them individually, their eternal rivalries preventing true cooperation. But Nurgle's doubt, Tzeentch's forced honesty, and Khorne's wounded pride had accomplished what eons of mutual hatred could not. They had finally driven the ruinous powers to act as one. "They are coordinating," he said, feeling the weight of divine attention pressing down upon them like a physical force. For the first time since their ascension, the four gods are truly working together. That makes them far more dangerous than any individual threat we have faced. The palace gates stood open, but passage through them required walking a gauntlet that had been prepared with the combined malevolence of all four Chaos gods. Khorne's rage filled the air like smoke, making every breath taste of copper and violence. Tzeentch's schemes writhed beneath the surface of reality, turning each step into a potential trap designed to redirect their path toward destruction. Nurgle's influence made the very stones weep with diseases that promised peace through surrender. And over it all, Slanesh's presence pressed against their consciousness like honey mixed with poison, offering everything they had ever wanted in exchange for their souls. But Kratos walked through it all with the steady determination of someone who had faced similar trials before. Each temptation was met with remembrance of lessons learned, each threat countered by wisdom paid for in divine blood. Beside him, Celestine followed with faith burning like a beacon in the darkness, her devotion to the Emperor creating a bubble of sanctity that even the combined power of chaos could not fully penetrate. They found Slanesh waiting in the palace's heart, but the Prince of Pleasure was no longer alone. Shadows of the other gods flickered around the throne, Khorne's brass armor glinting in impossible light, Tzeentch's crystalline form refracting possibilities like a prism, Nurgle's bloated presence radiating diseased compassion. For the first time in 60 million years, the ruinous powers stood united, their eternal rivalries set aside in the face of an existential threat. "Welcome, God-killer," Slanesh purred, but its voice carried harmonics of desperation that even perfect vocal control could not entirely hide. "You have been most educational. My brothers and I have learned much from observing your progress through our domains. We now understand what we face, and we have prepared accordingly." The Dark Prince gestured with one elegant hand, and reality shimmered like heat haze. When it cleared, they stood not in the palace throne room, but in a perfect recreation of Kratos' home from his mortal days. Every detail was flawless, from the scent of olive oil burning in clay lamps to the sound of children playing in the courtyard beyond. At the room's center sat two figures whose presence made Kratos' divine heart skip a beat. Lysandra and Calliope waited for him, but these were not the crude phantoms that had been used against him before. These were perfect recreations, carrying not just the appearance of his lost family, but their actual souls, preserved and purified through the combined power of 4 gods working in harmony. When they spoke, their voices carried the genuine love that had once been his entire world. "My beloved," Lysandra said, rising to embrace him with arms that felt exactly as he remembered. "You have suffered so long, fought so hard, carried such burden. Come home. Rest. Let the wars be fought by others for once." Calliope ran to him with the unrestrained joy that only children could express, her laughter ringing like silver bells in the false twilight. "Papa, I've been waiting for you. Mama says you've been fighting bad people, but you don't have to anymore. We can be together forever now." For a moment, one terrible, wonderful moment, Kratos felt his iron resolve waver. This was not illusion or deception. Through some miracle of divine cooperation, the gods had actually managed to restore what had been lost, to undo the single greatest tragedy of his existence. His family could live again, love again, be whole again. All he had to do was stop fighting, lay down his weapons, accept what was being offered. "Beautiful, is it not?" Slanesh whispered from everywhere and nowhere, its voice like silk against skin. "We have offered you shadows before, echoes and phantoms designed to mock your pain. But this is real. Your family restored, your guilt absolved, your purpose fulfilled. You sought justice for their deaths, and we offer you something better, their lives returned. Surely that is worth ending this pointless crusade." Sister Celestine watched in horror as Kratos took a step toward his family, then another. She could see the internal war raging behind his eyes, the love of a father battling against the wisdom of ages, the desire for peace struggling with the knowledge of what that peace would cost. Part of her wanted to intervene, to remind him of their mission, but she understood that this was a choice only he could make. You would give me everything I have ever wanted, Kratos said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. My family restored. My pain ended. My war finally won. But at what cost? What price would you extract from the galaxy for this miracle? No price, Khorne rumbled from the shadows, his voice carrying unusual restraint. No service required, no worship demanded. Simply, cease your interference. Allow us to continue as we have for 60 million years. We will trouble you no more, and you need trouble us no more. The mortals who suffer under your rule? Kratos asked, still staring at his family, but not yet embracing them. The billions who die in agony to feed your appetites? The children who will never grow up because gods require their pain as sustenance? Will find their own peace in time, Tzeentch added, its crystalline voice carrying forced calm. As all things do. Change is eternal. Suffering is temporary. What is the pain of billions weighed against the joy of your family restored? Kratos looked down at Calliope, seeing in her young face all the innocence and hope that he had once believed the gods existed to protect. She was real, completely and utterly real. He could save her, love her, watch her grow up in peace. All he had to do was abandon every other family in the galaxy to the mercy of beings who had never learned the meaning of the word. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And for a moment, no one, not his family, not the gods, not even Celestine, understood what he meant. Then the power of hope blazed forth with an intensity that made their previous encounters seem like candle flames. But this time, the golden light carried something new. Not the desperate hope of the drowning, or the bitter hope of the conquered, but the mature hope of someone who had learned that love sometimes meant letting go, that peace purchased with others' suffering was not peace at all. The perfect recreation of his family began to dissolve, but not into the corruption that had marked previous illusions. Instead, they faded with gentle smiles, their eyes filled not with accusation, but with understanding. In their final moments, they looked upon the man Kratos had become, not the rage-driven killer he had once been, but someone who had learned to choose the greater good over personal desire. And they were proud. "I love you," Lysandra whispered as she faded. "Both of you. That is why we understand." "Keep fighting the bad people, Papa," Calliope added, her voice growing distant. "Someone has to protect the other children." The throne room snapped back into focus, but something fundamental had changed. The combined assault of the four gods had not only failed, it had revealed the true nature of what they faced. Kratos was not simply a god-killer driven by rage or ambition. He was something far more dangerous to their existence, a being who had learned to choose virtue over desire, justice over personal satisfaction, hope over despair. Slaanesh screamed as the implications of that revelation struck home. Around the palace, reality began to crack as the Prince of Pleasure's absolute certainty in the power of desire crumbled like a house built on sand. If mortals could choose virtue over appetite, growth over gratification, love over lust, then what purpose did the Dark Prince serve? The other gods felt their brother's crisis of faith and were themselves shaken. Khorne's rage faltered as he confronted the possibility that strength could serve justice rather than domination. Tzeentch's schemes unraveled as he faced the truth that some choices could not be manipulated or predicted. Nurgle's compassion curdled as he realized that genuine mercy might not require the surrender of hope. "This is impossible," Slaanesh wailed, its perfect form beginning to crack and blur as fundamental contradictions tore at its essence. Desire is the driving force of existence. Without want, without need, without hunger for something better, there is no motivation for action. You cannot simply choose to be content with what is just, rather than what is wanted. I can, Kratos said simply, advancing toward the disintegrating god with measured steps, because I have learned that the greatest love is not taking what you desire, but protecting others from the consequences of your appetites. My family is at peace. They do not need to be disturbed for my comfort. The galaxy's children deserve the same consideration. The battle that followed was brief, but cataclysmic. Slaanesh threw everything it had at the god-killer. Every temptation, every seduction, every promise of perfect fulfillment that had ever corrupted a mortal soul. But each attack broke against the simple truth that Kratos had found something more satisfying than desire itself, the knowledge that his choices had meaning beyond their immediate consequences. When the Dark Prince fell, its collapse sent shockwaves through all 4 domains simultaneously. The warp itself began to convulse as the fundamental forces that had shaped it for 60 million years suddenly found themselves changed. Not destroyed, but transformed, their absolute certainties replaced by questions they had never been forced to consider. Sister Celestine stared at the crumbling palace around them, watching as eons of careful construction dissolved into component possibilities. "You've done it," she breathed. "You've actually defeated them. All 4 chaos gods brought low by a single warrior." But Kratos' expression carried no triumph, only a deep and abiding sadness. "No," he said quietly. "I have wounded them, humbled them, forced them to question their certainties. But I have not destroyed them. That was never the answer." "Then what?" "I have shown them another way," he said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. "But showing is not the same as choosing. That decision must be theirs to make. And if they choose poorly—" Around them, the warp continued to convulse, reality itself struggling to accommodate the possibility that its fundamental forces might be capable of change. The war for the galaxy's soul had reached its climax, and the outcome remained balanced on the edge of a blade that could cut toward salvation or damnation with equal ease. The next choice would determine which way it fell. The first tremor through the warp felt like the death of a star, a psychic shockwave that sent ripples across the galaxy's length and breadth. Sister Celestine gasped as she felt it through her connection to the Emperor's divine light, a sudden absence where there should have been presence, a silence where there had always been the background whisper of malevolent consciousness. The 4 chaos gods, wounded and humbled though they were, had always provided a terrible sort of stability to the immaterium. Now, with their certainties shattered and their power diminished, that stability was collapsing. "What have we done?" she whispered, her enhanced senses detecting disturbances that registered as pure terror in her augmented nervous system. Through her communion with the Emperor's will, she could feel the effects rippling outward from their location, like cracks spreading through glass. On distant worlds, psychers were convulsing as the warp's familiar patterns dissolved into chaos of a different, more fundamental kind. Kratos stood amid the ruins of Slaanesh's palace, his divine senses reaching out through dimensions that mortal minds couldn't comprehend. What he found there filled him with a horror that dwarfed any physical threat he had ever faced. In his single-minded pursuit of justice against the 4 gods, he had failed to consider the role they played in maintaining the warp's basic architecture. Like pillars supporting a vast roof, their absolute certainties had provided structure to the realm of souls and dreams. With those certainties removed, the entire edifice was beginning to collapse. "The Astronomicon," Celestine breathed, her voice tight with growing panic. "I can feel it. flickering. The Emperor's light grows dim, not from any assault upon it, but because the medium through which it travels is becoming unstable. Without the Chaos God's influence, providing familiar pathways through the immaterium, navigation will become impossible. Ships will be lost. Entire sectors will be cut off from imperial support. Through his connection to the power that had once sustained Olympus, Kratos felt the tremors in real space that accompanied the warp's convulsions. Stars were going nova as their fusion reactions became unstable under the influence of collapsing psychic fields. Entire star systems were winking out of existence as space-time itself forgot how to maintain coherent structure. Worlds that had known peace for millennia suddenly found themselves racked by psychic storms that turned thoughts to fire and dreams to poison. But worse than the cosmic disasters were the smaller tragedies that multiplied like cancer across the galaxy's breadth. On Holy Terra itself, the Golden Throne's mechanisms were straining to compensate for fluctuations in the warp's fundamental structure. The Emperor's psychic essence, spread thin across 10,000 years of maintaining the Astronomicon, was being forced to work ever harder to maintain a beacon through an ocean that no longer followed its own rules. On Baal, the Blood Angels felt their genetic curse intensify as the warp's instability resonated with the flaw in their gene seed. Brother turned on brother as the red thirst became uncontrollable, their noble savagery devolving into mindless cannibalism. On Fenris, the space wolves howled as their animal spirits were driven mad by psychic interference that spoke in frequencies their enhanced genetics could not filter. On Ultramar, entire companies of ultramarines stood paralyzed as their tactical doctrines became useless in a universe where cause and effect no longer operated according to predictable patterns. The human toll was beyond calculation. On hive worlds where billions lived in delicate balance, the failure of psychic communication networks led to cascading failures in food distribution. Children starved in the upper spires, while warehouses of grain rotted in the underhives, their managers unable to coordinate relief efforts through Vox systems that now carried only screaming static. On agri-worlds, farmers watched their crops wither and die as the machine spirits that controlled irrigation systems lost contact with their human operators. On forge worlds, tech priests wept oil tears as their most sacred machineries fell silent, their machine spirits retreating into electronic hibernation rather than face the psychic chaos that pressed against their logic cores. Billions, Kratos said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute understanding. Billions are dying because of my choices. I sought to free mortals from the tyranny of corrupt gods, but I have condemned them to something worse, the chaos that exists in the absence of any order at all. Through the collapsing barriers between dimensions, they could hear the voices of the dying. Not the screams of battle or the cries of plague victims, but something far more heartbreaking, the quiet whimpers of children who were slowly starving because food distribution networks had failed, the desperate prayers of colonists watching their atmospheric processes shut down one by one, the final transmissions of exploration fleets lost forever in a warp that no longer remembered how to guide them home. There has to be a way, Celestine said, her faith burning like a beacon in the darkness, but unable to illuminate a solution to the crisis they had created. The Emperor protects. He would not allow the galaxy to die simply because we sought justice against its corruptors. Kratos closed his burning eyes and reached deeper into the power that had always sustained him. Not rage, not fury, but the pure essence of hope that Athena had gifted him in her final moments. What he found there was not the answer he had expected, but it was the answer that the situation demanded. The Chaos Gods could not be destroyed without destroying the stability they provided. But perhaps they could be changed. I know what must be done, he said, opening his eyes to meet Celestine's desperate gaze. But the price will be everything I am. Are you prepared to witness that sacrifice? Before she could answer, the warp around them began to stabilize as Kratos reached out with his divine essence and began to weave new patterns in the fabric of reality itself. But instead of destroying the wounded gods or allowing them to heal back to their former malevolence, he began something far more ambitious, a transformation that would preserve their function while changing their fundamental nature. The power of hope that flowed through him was not the desperate hope of the drowning or the bitter hope of the conquered. It was the mature hope of someone who had learned that true love sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice, not just of life, but of the desire for personal satisfaction. Instead of claiming victory over the gods, he chose to redeem them, using his own divine essence as the catalyst for their transformation. Khorne's rage didn't disappear, but it was refined, transformed from mindless bloodlust into righteous fury that served justice rather than feeding on chaos. The blood god's followers felt the change like a cool breeze on fevered skin, their berserker madness suddenly focused into disciplined fury that protected the innocent rather than slaughtering them indiscriminately. Tzeentch's schemes continued to unfold, but their purpose shifted from manipulation for its own sake to genuine guidance toward positive change. The Changer of Ways plots became less about controlling outcomes and more about helping mortals find their own paths to growth and enlightenment, complexity serving wisdom rather than confusion. Nurgle's compassion remained, but it was purified of its selfish need to create the despair it claimed to heal. The Plaguefather's gifts became genuine mercy, the strength to endure suffering with dignity rather than surrender to it, healing that came from within rather than dependence on external sources of comfort. Slanesh's appreciation for beauty and perfection was preserved, but stripped of the hunger that could never be satisfied. The Dark Prince's influence became inspiration rather than obsession, encouraging mortals to create and achieve rather than consume and possess. The transformation required everything Kratos had, not just his power, but his very existence as a separate entity. Like a candle that burns itself out to provide light for others, he poured his divine essence into the wounded gods, using his own spiritual substance to heal the cracks in their nature, while fundamentally altering what they were. "No!" Celestine cried out as she realized what he was doing. "There has to be another way. You don't have to sacrifice yourself for beings who have caused such suffering." "I do," Kratos replied, his form already becoming translucent as his essence flowed into the transformation. "Because that is what love truly means. Not taking what you want, but giving what is needed. The galaxy needs these forces to exist, but it needs them to serve life rather than feed upon it. This is the only way to achieve that balance." Sister Celestine watched in horror and awe as the being who had become more than friend, more than ally, more than the greatest warrior she had ever known, chose to sacrifice everything he was for the sake of mortals he would never meet. But even as his individual existence faded, something of Kratos remained, not as a separate consciousness, but as a fundamental principle woven into the transformed nature of the Chaos Gods themselves. Hope, justice, the choice to serve something greater than oneself. The understanding that true strength came not from domination, but from protection. The knowledge that genuine love required sacrifice without the expectation of reward. As the transformation completed, the warp's convulsions began to subside. The Astronomicon blazed forth with renewed strength, its light no longer fighting against the Immaterium's currents, but flowing with them in harmony. Across the galaxy, the dying began to stabilize as food distribution networks came back online. Atmospheric processors resumed their function, and the machine spirits that governed civilization emerged from their electronic hibernation. On 1,000,000 worlds, children who had been crying from hunger fell silent as their parents found food. Explorers lost in the void felt their navigation systems suddenly lock onto familiar stellar patterns. Soldiers who had been driven to madness by chaotic influences felt their minds clear as the forces that had tormented them transformed into sources of strength and guidance. The Chaos Gods still existed, but they were no longer the same entities that had fed upon galactic suffering for 60 million years. They had become something new, forces that could inspire mortals to greatness rather than drag them down to damnation. Powers that offered genuine choice rather than the illusion of freedom. Deities who served their worshippers' growth rather than feeding on their despair. Sister Celestine knelt in the transformed warp and wept for the being who had taught her that faith could be about more than duty, that strength could serve mercy rather than conquest, that even gods could be redeemed if someone was willing to pay the price for their salvation. The ghost of Sparta was gone, but his choice echoed through the fundamental structure of reality itself, ensuring that his sacrifice would bear fruit for generations yet to come. The morning sun rose over the rebuilt cathedral on Tertius Prime, casting golden light through stained glass windows that told a story no imperial artisan had ever dared to depict. In the central panel, 4 figures knelt before a 5th, not in worship, but in acknowledgement of transformation. The Chaos Gods were shown not as the malevolent entities that had terrorized the galaxy for 60 million years, but as they had become, forces of nature that served life rather than feeding upon it. Sister Superior Celestine stood before the altar, no longer wearing the black and bone livery of the Order of the Valorous Heart, but simple robes that bore no heraldry save the golden flame of hope embroidered upon the breast. Around her, a gathering unlike any in imperial history listened as she spoke of the changes that had swept across the galaxy in the 7 years since the transformation. "On Cardia, the fortress world stands stronger than ever," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed miracles and chosen to believe in their reality. The eye of terror still swirls in the void above, but its malevolence has been replaced by something approaching benevolence. Where once demons poured forth to corrupt and destroy, now come beings that offer genuine guidance to those who seek to grow beyond their limitations. The assembled listeners, space marines whose genetic flaws had been healed by Nurgle's transformed gifts, Imperial Guard veterans who fought with the righteous fury that Khorne now provided, tech priests whose innovations were inspired by Tzeentch's genuine desire for progress, and artists whose works carried the beauty that Slaanesh had learned to create rather than consume, nodded with the understanding of those who had lived through the transition. In the back of the cathedral, partially hidden by shadows that seemed to bend around him of their own accord, stood a figure that most would not recognize. Kratos was no longer the pale-skinned giant who had emerged from dimensional rifts with murder in his eyes. His sacrifice in the warp had changed him, not destroying his individual consciousness, but reforging it into something that existed simultaneously within and beyond the transformed Chaos Gods. He was smaller now, more human in appearance, his divine nature expressed not through overwhelming physical presence, but through an aura of absolute certainty that some things were worth protecting regardless of the cost. His face bore lines that spoke of ages spent in contemplation rather than battle, and his eyes held depths that reflected not rage, but the kind of peace that could only be earned through the willing embrace of necessary sacrifice. The space wolves of Fenris no longer howl with madness when the Wolfen curse takes them, Celestine continued, her gaze finding his in the gathered crowd. Instead, they transform into protectors whose bestial strength serves to shield their brothers rather than slaughter indiscriminately. The Blood Angels have found that their red thirst can be sated not through the consumption of enemy blood, but through the righteous fury that burns away injustice wherever it is found. A young space marine of the Ultramarines, his armor bearing the scars of campaigns fought in service of the New Order, raised his hand. Sister Superior, what of those who refuse to accept the transformation? Surely not all of Chaos's servants have embraced this change. Celestine's expression grew more serious, acknowledging the weight of the question. There are those who cling to the old ways, who seek to corrupt the transformed gods back to their former malevolence, pirates who invoke the blood god's name while committing acts of meaningless slaughter, sorcerers who attempt to manipulate the changer of ways for personal gain, plague cults that spread disease for its own sake, rather than as part of the natural cycle of growth and renewal, hedonists who pursue sensation without regard for the suffering they cause. Her gaze found Kratos again, and a small smile touched her lips. But they do not go unchallenged. There are those who have taken it upon themselves to ensure that the new balance is preserved, that the gods' transformation is not undone by those who would exploit their power for selfish ends. After the service, as the cathedral emptied and the faithful returned to their daily lives in a galaxy slowly learning to hope again, Celestine approached the shadowed alcove where Kratos waited. 7 years had not diminished the bond forged between them in the depths of the warp, though it had changed, as both had grown into roles they had never anticipated. "You could reveal yourself," she said, settling beside him on the stone bench that faced the transformed world beyond the cathedral's windows. "The Imperium has accepted so many impossibilities in recent years. One more miracle would hardly strain credibility." Kratos shook his head, a gesture that carried the wisdom of someone who had learned the difference between recognition and effectiveness. "The moment they begin to worship me, as they once worshipped the Emperor, the balance I died to create will be lost. Hope cannot be imposed from above. It must grow from within. My role now is not to be seen, but to ensure that those who would corrupt hope into despair do not succeed." Through the windows, they could see the fruits of the transformation playing out across Tertius Prime's rebuilt surface. Children played in gardens, where Nurgle's influence helped food grow abundant and healthy, their laughter carrying no fear of the diseases that had once claimed so many young lives. Artists worked in studios blessed by Slanesh's transformed presence, creating beauty that uplifted the spirit rather than enslaving it to obsession. Scholars studied in libraries, where Tzeentch's gift of knowledge served enlightenment rather than manipulation. Warriors trained in courtyards, where Khorne's influence taught them to fight with honor rather than bloodlust. "Tell me of your students," Celestine said, for she knew that Kratos's true work lay not in grand gestures, but in quiet teaching. A rare smile crossed the former god's face as he spoke of the men and women he had been training over the past 7 years, individuals from across the galaxy who had shown the potential to resist corruption, not through ignorance, but through understanding. Space Marines who had learned to channel their genetic gifts toward protection rather than conquest. Inquisitors who sought truth without becoming consumed by paranoia. Guardsmen who fought with courage, born of hope rather than desperation. They come from every world, every background, every level of society, he said with quiet pride. What they share is not power or position, but the choice to serve something greater than themselves. I teach them what I learned in my journey through the realm of gods, that true strength comes not from domination, but from protection, that genuine wisdom lies in knowing when not to use one's power, and that the greatest victory is sometimes achieved through willing sacrifice. As the afternoon wore on toward evening, they spoke of the challenges that still remained. The Necrons, awakening to find a galaxy fundamentally changed from the one they remembered. The Tyranids, whose hunger remained as vast and mindless as ever, forcing the transformed Chaos Gods to work in harmony with Imperial forces to repel each new hive fleet. The Orcs, whose love of violence had been partially channeled by Khorne's transformation, but who still posed a constant threat to peaceful development. And yet, Celestine observed, for the first time in 10,000 years, humanity looks to the future with something approaching optimism. Children born after the transformation grow up expecting to become something greater than their parents, rather than simply hoping to survive long enough to reproduce. Scientists pursue knowledge without fear that their discoveries will be corrupted by forces beyond their understanding. Artists create without worrying that their inspiration comes from malevolent entities seeking to damn their souls. As night fell over the cathedral world, Kratos rose to leave, as he always did when duty called him elsewhere in the galaxy. But this time, Celestine caught his arm, her expression suddenly serious. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "The choice you made? You could have claimed victory over the gods, could have been remembered as the greatest hero in galactic history. Instead, you chose transformation over conquest, redemption over revenge. Do you ever wonder what might have been if you had chosen differently?" Kratos considered her question with the careful attention it deserved, his gaze turning to the transformed symbols carved into the cathedral's walls. "I think," he said finally, "of the children who will grow up in a galaxy where gods serve mortal needs rather than feeding on mortal suffering. I think of the artists who will create beauty without fear of damnation, the scholars who will pursue knowledge without corruption, the warriors who will fight for justice rather than glory. I think of the billions who will live and love and hope because someone chose sacrifice over satisfaction." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the certainty of absolute truth. "I spent millennia seeking vengeance for wrongs that could not be undone. In the end, I learned that the dead do not need revenge. The living need hope. If my choice has given them that, then I regret nothing." With those words, he stepped back into the shadows that always seemed to welcome him, disappearing into the night to continue his eternal vigil. Somewhere in the galaxy, cultists plotted to return the gods to their former malevolence. Somewhere, tyrants sought to exploit the new balance for personal gain. Somewhere, those who had profited from the old order of despair and corruption schemed to undo the transformation that had cost one being everything he was. They would find their efforts opposed by warriors trained in the ancient arts of resistance, by teachers who understood that corruption could only be defeated through wisdom rather than force, by guardians who had learned that some things were worth preserving at any cost. Sister Superior Celestine knelt before the altar, as she had every night for 7 years, her prayers no longer pleading for deliverance, but giving thanks for transformation. In her devotions, She remembered the being who had taught her that faith could serve hope rather than fear, that strength could protect rather than dominate, that even gods could be redeemed if someone was willing to pay the price. The galaxy was still dangerous, still filled with threats that could end human civilization in a heartbeat. But for the first time in 60 million years, those threats were balanced by genuine hope. The knowledge that growth was possible, that corruption could be resisted, that tomorrow might truly be better than today. In the end, that hope was the greatest monument to the ghost of Sparta's sacrifice, more enduring than any statue, more precious than any legend. The God-Slayer rested not in death, but in the knowledge that his choice had transformed not just 4 divine entities, but the entire structure of reality itself. The war was over. The peace that followed would be eternal vigilance. But it would be vigilance in service of hope rather than despair. And that, Kratos had learned, was enough.